This is Atomic Shinobi and today I'm going to narrate first part of what if Naruto sealed the Kyuubi inside his younger self. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no time, let's start the story.
The human soul was a strange little entity. Without the body's armor of flesh and skin, they were helpless and incapable of defending themselves. They were strong, though, because the body was only a puppet without the soul. The real source of power was the soul. Mortals were stupid. They constantly attempted to hoard power and boost their physical strength, undervaluing the soul's actual worth. They repressed their own souls and corroded them for power. How pointless. After all, the body was merely a temporary shell. The soul was eternal. Sitting in his cage with his big head on his paws, Kyuubi watched, somewhat amused, the latest mess his ship had found itself in. He had a peculiar relationship with Naruto. He hated his ship with all his heart. He disliked being confined, just like every other living thing on the planet. He disliked having anyone, much less a helpless human, limit his freedom of movement and desires. However, the soul of his host was beautiful, and even Kyuubi could be enchanted by beauty. People's conceptions of the soul were romantic. They believed that the characteristics of pure souls were kindness, naive gentleness, and foolish innocence. They were mistaken. A pure soul had great power. It was something that could survive and even thrive in a sea of corruption. A soul could endure the mistreatment of 1,000 sinners and still be able to forgive. Even in its darkest moments, a pure soul was superior to those who had never touched blood. One of the purest in the world was Naruto's. Yes, he had attempted to corrupt the brat in the hopes that the brat's rigid morals would be compromised by the sheer evil in his chakra. He had tempted Naruto by using every trick in the book and exploiting a very dire situation. It hadn't worked. His repressed dark emotions were the closest he had come to corrupting Naruto. His pain at his friend's persistent disrespect, his rage at the injustice he experienced as a child, and his anguish over the betrayal of his best friend. However, the strength of his jailer's will had prevented even that attempt. Reluctantly, Kyuubi was enthralled with the brilliance of his lovely soul and left to marvel at his captor. Letting such a hardy creature die would be such a waste. And by a mere human being at that. He should be the one to break Naruto's repulsively pure soul, the prisoner the boy had managed to keep imprisoned for more than 10 years. So he faced an interesting conundrum. The current state of affairs was ultimately brought about by Naruto's rash desire to aid and defend the people of his village. Naruto had grown to love and cherish Konoha, but under Danzo, it was no longer his home. That man's strict, belligerent tendencies had killed the will of fire that Sandaime had cultivated. Naruto had tried, very discreetly and cleverly, to undermine Danzo's plans from within, but he had failed. Now his jailer was facing the death penalty. Naturally, Danzo refused to let Kyuubi perish alongside Naruto. He would take Kyuubi away from Naruto and move him to another pliable, undeserving ship. Additionally, Kyuubi was aware that Madara was waiting outside the village, prepared to storm in and remove Kyuubi from Konoha. The Biju had no intention of losing his identity and assimilating into the Jubi. Naruto would take the demon with him when he killed himself before anyone could try to remove Kyuubi. Nor was Kyuubi going to allow that, but he had one hurdle to overcome. Danzo. That man had a cunning that could compete with that of a snake. His blind, perverted, and filthy devotion to the village was more detrimental than beneficial. He had assumed the title of Hokage by using the Akatsuki's invasion of Konoha. When Tsunade was weak, he had marched in and assumed her role in the most ignominious way. Danzo hadn't given his host much attention at first. As requested by Tsunade, who was exiled, Naruto had stayed faithful to Konoha. Danzo hadn't been overly worried about him, then. Rokudame Hokage was determined to hold onto Naruto, the powerhouse, because he had served his village. Naruto's training had been taken up by Danzo himself. He had made sure that neither Konoha nor Naruto would ever betray him, and Kyuubi was aware of how happy he was with the outcome. Naruto became well known. Danzo used him as a tool to give Konoha more power. Their enemies grew so terrified of him that they were forced to comply with Danzo's orders just by being around him. Kyuubi was willing to accept the status quo. Despite his bloodthirstiness, he admired Naruto's current role as an ANBU commander. At that point, Naruto began to be viewed by the Konoha community as a potential Danzo successor. A way out of Danzo. At that time, the old belligerent had gone for the kill. To keep Naruto in line, he employed every shady strategy in the book. By falsely accusing his childhood friends of treason, he destroyed Naruto's personal support system. Naruto lost contact with each of the people who had kept him alive and hopeful, one by one. Despite the lack of evidence supporting their survival, The hope of Konoha continued to hold on to the belief that his friends were still alive somewhere in captivity. Danzo targeted the one person preserving Konoha's hope for independence when protests there escalated to the point where a civil war seemed imminent. Naruto Uzumaki. Danzo would be sorry. Kyuubi was aware of that. Below the surface, rebellion was simmering and brewing. Naruto had become the last hope for many ninja and villagers to escape Danzo's tyrannical control. They were aware that Naruto possessed sufficient strength and backing to overthrow the Rokudame Hokage and assume his place. He wouldn't last long, even if he were to kill Naruto, something Kyuubi would never permit. The demon was aware that a lot of people wanted to kill him and that none of them had Naruto's level of mercy. The answer was simple. Before Danzo could even carry out his plans, he had to get Naruto out of Konoha. With a low, sluggish purr, the demon called, "Brat, come to me." Before long, a young, attractive man was standing in front of him. He was steadily stared at by eyes like a chip of ice. Some of his long blonde hair cradled his finely sculpted face as it swayed slightly in a top knot. The tall, slender man was the perfect example of what a shinobi should be. He looked like a valiant, attractive warrior that women would lust after. For a while, Kyuubi watched him in silence, looking at Naruto's unblinking eyes with mild amusement. "How long till you were executed by the fool?" asked he. Apparently unaffected by the knowledge that he would soon be killed, Naruto cocked his head thoughtfully to the side. His smooth, low voice reverberated softly in the chamber as he whispered, "That I don't know. They said that he won't announce when I'm going to be executed because he fears that the rebels will try to stop it and rescue me." While channeling his chakra to circle Naruto, Kyuubi hummed reflectively, saying, "My stay with you has been amusing, brat. I'm not about to let it end so early." Kyuubi smiled at Naruto's bewildered expression, his menacing fangs shining in the shadows, adding, "It seems fate has something more in store for you yet." Choosing to remain silent, the ANBU captain blinked at the demon. He was surrounded by brilliant fire, but he was unaffected. Flames engulfed him, and his long hair fluttered. "You're a toy, Namikaze Naruto. A puppet. However, no one but the fate is permitted to play with you." Naruto sighed. "Your purpose has not yet been fulfilled. You can't defy fate and willingly give up on life. There's a prophecy at play here, boy, and you're a part of it." With a menacing flash of cool blue eyes, "What do you mean to imply, Kyuubi?" "You'll understand when it is time for you to understand." The fox laughed as he said, "Too much damage has already been done. We must do this all over again. I give you this one jutsu. A jutsu that no one in Konoha but you can perform. You will take us back in time to the day before your birth, the day before I attacked Konoha." With a disgusted frown on his lips, Naruto said, "You're deluded to think that I'd agree to this scheme. You think that I'm willing to believe the words coming from the mouth of a demon?" Kyuubi's grin widened. "Do you wish for Konoha to burn underneath the wrath of that man? Do you wish for your precious friends to die? To see the village that your father sacrificed his life for, perish because you were too reluctant to accept the words of a demon? My motives are entirely selfish. Uchiha Madara is waiting for the right moment to strike. I have no desire to merge with the Kyuubi and end my existence." For a brief moment, Naruto's cold face wavered as his gaze locked with Kyuubi's. "You speak the truth? Do you swear on Inari Sama that you speak the truth?" Kyuubi's gaze grew strained. The strongest binding oath Naruto could require of the Kyuubi no Kitsune was an oath taken in Inari Sama's name. Kyuubi would be unable to lie about the situation once sworn in. But he also knew that Naruto wouldn't believe him if he didn't have the oath. The demon could feel the weight of the oath bearing down on him as he vowed, "I swear in the name of Inari Sama that I speak the truth. As far as I know, there is no other way to deal with this situation and you must do as I say." Then he said, "Very well." He agreed, "However, I still fail to see how I'd ever be able to perform the seal when I'm being watched constantly. Moreover, I'm being housed in a prison cell that soaks up my chakra as soon as I release it." Kyuubi smiled slowly, amusement shining in his eyes. "Who said that you cannot perform the seal here, in your mind?" Naruto's gaze expanded. Namikaze Minato scowled as he warily rubbed his temples in an attempt to relieve the ache that had grown there. Scrolls describing different sealing techniques were scattered across his desk in front of him. He sighed and leaned forward, examining a single scroll before him. Evil Spirit Binding Seal. One of the most effective ways to keep an evil spirit contained and weaken it enough to kill it is to seal it into an animal. The spirit can only use the inherent strength of the host body once it has been sealed into a low, harmless animal. All of the abilities it had prior to being sealed away will be lost. Too weak, Minato shook his head, thinking, "This will only work on low-level demons, not a Biju." This seal would never be able to contain a demon as strong as Kyuubi no Kitsune. Frustrated, he threw the scroll aside and picked up another. The Soul Seal is an S-class kinjutsu that is extremely dangerous and should only be used in extreme situations. A soul will be torn from its natural body and destroyed by this seal. Since the body will have no soul, it will be simpler to murder. However, the result will be catastrophic if the person who applies this seal to his opponent is not spiritually and psychologically stronger than his opponent. More mental and willpower than a centuries-old demon? Minato sneered. You must be kidding me. This will never work. He unfolded another scroll absently and paused, reading the title with wide eyes. Shiki Fujin. Determination narrowed the crystal blue eyes. Shiki Fujin ought to be at work. It would work, but it would cost him his life. But even with the Shinigami's help, Kyuubi would not be so easily vanquished. Minato would be dead by the time the demon escaped, so he couldn't assist. He raked his fingers through his hair in exasperation, saying, just Shiki Fujin would not do. Kyuubi is too strong for me to handle alone, so I need to work with Shiki Fujin on something. There was something about the whole thing that annoyed him. Konoha was to be destroyed, but who had the authority to rule Kyuubi in such a manner? Such an entity was unlikely to be under the command or control of any human. The Kyuubi could only be controlled by one person. According to history, Kyuubi could only be called upon and controlled by one person. He gave a headshake. He's dead. There's no point in contemplating it. Kami. Sama. Assist me, he said, glancing down at the scrolls strewn across his desk. I have no other choice. His eyes widened and his skin turned pale as one word suddenly sounded like a death knell in his head. Jinchuriki. That was not even something he wanted to think about, but there wasn't much time left, and that was the only way he could think of to solve the problem. He was aware that there were Jinchuriki in other villages, but why put such a burden on one individual? Was he capable of it? Minato felt shivers at the mere thought of the Ichibi being sealed into his youngest child by the case cage. His own son. How could that jerk have been so mean to put his son through that? His own wife was killed, and Minato was aware that no amount of power could ever justify such a high cost. He was bound to think of his wife as a result of those thoughts. He and his extremely pregnant wife became even more pale. No, 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 he said, shaking his head, flinching at the idea. He combed his hair with a trembling hand. I can't do it, God forbid. He frantically thought to himself, I'll find someone else. Surely there are orphans. I can't force this upon my son, I can't. With a sharp twinge of sadness, Minato winced and closed his eyes. He didn't want to sacrifice his own child, so how could he consider sacrificing someone else's? How would he behave as a Hokage? Minato decided to give it some thought later and shook his head. He had to figure out how to safely seal the demon inside a child without endangering the host. Either his own child or a different person's. He began sifting through the scrolls before him, keeping that somber thought in mind. But when he felt a slight change in the surroundings, his hand stumbled. He noticed a complicated seal burning itself onto his office's wooden floor as he peered past his desk. He quickly reached for his kunai after recognizing the rare, forbidden seal. Fuin no Kami Hitotoki. Time seal command. Like his Hiraishin, it was an incredibly intricate seal. To attempt such a jutsu, one needed a lot of chakra and precise control. The person had to be proficient in all facets of Fuin jutsu, including hand seals, in order to successfully travel through time. The individual had a mere 30 seconds to begin and finish the technique. It took a great deal of skill. It was clear that whoever was trying to get here was a very strong person. All Minato could hope for was that the individual wasn't an enemy. At that point, he didn't need any more stress. Suddenly, the office felt heavy, and the young Hokage readied himself to defend if needed. There he stood, calm and focused. He marveled at how perfect the seal design was as he looked at it after it had appeared on the floor. It was a masterpiece, flawlessly drawn, with not a single character out of place. There was no explosion, no smoke, no chakra surge. He actually didn't think anyone would have noticed it if it hadn't happened right in front of them. He was suddenly confronted by a tall, slender young man wearing the robes of the ANBU captain. Minato squinted, alert and prepared to defend if needed. The man's headband caught his keen eye, and he scowled upon seeing the proud Konoha insignia on it. He was a shinobi from Konoha. He asked in a neutral tone, "Who are you?" Minato nearly flinched in shock as the man's eyes clashed with Minato's as he looked up. Every time he looked into the mirror, he saw the same color. When the unidentified ANBU faltered, he acted quickly. He could see that the ninja was not in a fit state to fight. He carefully moved the man to sit on a chair while keeping a close eye on him to make sure it wasn't a facade. For a while, the time Traveler sat in silence, attempting to calm his trembling body and catch his breath. He carelessly brushed away his long, silky blonde hair, which stuck to his sweat, streaked face and stained his cheek and hair red with blood. At that moment, Minato saw that his wrists were bleeding, and Yondaime surmised that this was a result of the jutsu ritual. Minato waited calmly for the captain to gather his thoughts. He saw the stranger get his bearings, look around the office, and then turn to face him. At once, the ANBU stood up straight and started to pay attention. Before the young man could stand, Yondaime ordered, "At ease." He asked courteously, "An explanation, if you will?" But there was no denying the undertone of steel in his voice. The blonde said in a low baritone, "Pardon me for my sudden arrival, Yondaime. Sama. If you would permit, I would bandage these before I provide an explanation for my presence here," he said, lifting his bleeding wrists in front of the Hokage. With a nod, Minato retrieved a roll of bandage he always carried with him. He threw it at the boy, who flinched but skillfully bandaged his injuries. "I'm a loyal shinobi of Konohagakure, and I promise that I mean you or the village no harm. I know this is difficult to believe, but I'm willing to submit myself to a full investigation, if you so desire," the stranger said, establishing his sincerity by looking directly into Yondaime's eyes. Minato nodded in agreement after leaning back and closely observing him. The individual breathed deeply. "As far as my knowledge goes, you're an expert in seals. I assume you recognize the seal I used to transport myself here?" "Yes," Minato replied, "and it speaks greatly about your own skills and ability in seals. Obviously, it takes a lot of effort to perform, so why are you here and who are you?" The stranger tucked a strand of his hair behind his ear and ran his fingers through it. "As to who I am, well, are you quite ready to hear that, Yondaime?" "Sama," he said softly, his blue eyes staring at him with an expression he did not understand. "Why I am here is a long story that I will explain later." "Who are you?" Minato asked, squinting his eyes. "I went by the name of Uzumaki Naruto for the first 16 years of my life," the boy sighed, his lips forming a slight frown. "But my true name is Namikaze Naruto." Minato froze, staring at the person seated in front of him with wide eyes. With a slightly bitter smile, the young man said, "I see you understand," he said, in a dry whisper. "Let me confirm it. I am your son Yondaime. Sama." "Son?" Minato exclaimed, looking at the man before him with new eyes. His high cheekbones, arched brows, and blue eyes were all his. His mouth could curl into a wide grin, a mischievous smirk, or a stubborn frown. The length and straightness of his hair, as well as the shape of his eyes, were all Kushina. Along with the thin, slender build, Kushina was also the source of that unyielding light in Naruto's eyes. Incredulous, he said, "You are my son." He suddenly regained emotional control and squinted at the captain in front of him, asking, "Do you have any proof?" The mention of his wife made Yondaime freeze. "Yes, I know you're married to Uzumaki Kushina, or should I say Namikaze Kushina?" He leaned forward. "I know that you rescued her from a dangerous situation by following the trail she left behind." Naruto nodded calmly. "There is proof in my blood. You're free to test it against yours or my mother's." Yondaime tensed up. No one knew that specific story. Nobody knew what had transpired between him and Kushina during that mission. He had never told anyone how he had saved her. Yondaime slowly smiled back at Naruto, who said, "Only 2 men have complimented Mother's gorgeous red hair. And only those 2 men have received those precious words in return. You know them, don't you? Those words?" Leaning back in his chair, Minato watched his grown son and said, "Yes." With a schooled expression, Naruto concluded the sentimentality by saying, "There is little else I can tell you. Whether you believe me or not doesn't really affect my purpose here. According to the Yondaime, give me your profile." With a curt nod, Naruto held up his right hand. He focused, allowing his chakra to emerge and exposing the seal on his palm. "A storage seal on your own body. How does that work?" asked Yondaime, raising an eyebrow. Naruto laughed. "With a few modifications. Circumstance forced me to keep all valuable weapons and documents sealed on my person so that I could have access to them under any situation." That explanation seemed reasonable, and the Hokage nodded, but he did maintain his vigilance. He, too, had kept his weapons in that seal, the boy had said. Making sure that everything he did was clear, cut and easy, Naruto took out one scroll and set it on the cage's desk. He didn't want to be perceived as a danger by the Yondaime. Minato's alert, keen eyes scanned the details as he carefully picked up the scroll and unfolded it. "Graduating from academy after 2 failed attempts?" he asked sharply, raising a brow instantly and focusing his stern gaze on his son. Naruto just shrugged and looked directly into his father's eyes without even trying to look sorry. Minato turned back to the report and scowled. His grin widened as he continued. Why is your record so inconsistent? You were never promoted to Chunin but jumped directly to ANBU. Becoming a captain in less than a year? Why? Ranks didn't matter in my case. Naruto responded bluntly. I can't explain this thoroughly just yet, but let's just say, I saved the village from being destroyed completely and was rewarded for it. And on. Field promotion, if you will. He looked his father in the eyes. Feel free to evaluate me at any given time, Yondaime. Sama. My true achievements cannot be reflected on paper. This piece of paper gives away more than you realize. And C rank turned B rank successfully completed just weeks after becoming a genin. An A rank battle to defeat an enemy Jinchuriki. Retrieval mission to bring the Godem. Minato raised his eyebrows, so I can safely say that I don't exist here. Naruto nodded and closed his eyes. A rank to retrieve a traitor, though unsuccessful. A 2.5-year training trip as the apprentice of Jiraiya. Sensei. Minato laughed, like father like son. After that, an instant A rank to assist in rescuing the Godem K's cage. Another A rank to infiltrate an enemy village and retrieve a rogue nin. A rank, which was awarded to you for killing a missing nin. Another training expedition, and an S rank mission with a special mention. What the hell? I did say I rescued Konoha from near destruction. Minato questioned incredulously. You defeated an SS class shinobi? As a genin? I want full details. The report only gives me bare minimum. He said harshly before picking up the scroll. Tell me, have you ever done a normal, simple C-class mission? I have never witnessed such a misleading record. Officially, you should have been a Junin. Naruto sighed. I have. Still, my circumstances were different. Someday, I'll tell you the entire story if you so desire. Minato pointed to the scroll and questioned doubtfully, do I even want to read more? If you're getting a heart attack from just that, then I suggest you refrain. Went directly into the ANBU squad from there and took over the captainship 7 months after joining. I'm currently 18 years of age. I specialize in ninjutsu and fuin jutsu. He looked at the calendar that was on desk at home. Tomorrow. Your son will be born tomorrow. Minato raked his fingers through his hair and went pale. He said to himself in a whisper, tomorrow, the Kyuubi. Naruto's eyes narrowed, and he gave the scrolls strewn across the table a quick glance. A moment later, his face became cold. When Minato gave him a sharp look, he said, his lips curling into a smirk, preparing to seal away the Kyuubi. I see. He pointed to the scrolls and said blandly, that's one of the reasons why I'm here. I'll help you seal the demon within your son. No. Yondaime's defiance was immediate and loud. No, he muttered feebly as Naruto arched an eyebrow. Why him? With a shrug, Naruto said, we are a family of ninja. He said bluntly, that's what you said once, when you sealed away the Kyuubi. He took off his jacket, shirt, and ANBU cloak. Using his chakra, he let the seal materialize and said, this is something that I cannot stop. His icy blue eyes narrowed as he turned to face his father. What I can stop is your death. When Minato saw the seal and heard Naruto's words, she took a sharp breath. This. With pride, warning, and pain in his eyes, Naruto said, Shiki Fujin used in conjunction with Hake Fuin and Shisho Fuin. The very proof of your skill. It's a double-edged sword in my arsenal. It's the cause of almost all my troubles and also the very reason that I'm alive right now. Minato uttered a desperate, forgive me. I did what you had to do. Naruto replied, I'd have done the very same thing if I were in your position. He nodded his head, we'll have time for this later. I'm sure that you must have realized by now that Kyuubi is coming here for a reason? With narrowed eyes, Minato nodded. He would strive to be equally accepting if his son had the courage and wisdom to face the inevitable with such grace. Naruto whispered, there's something more at play here than just the Kyuubi. His father arched an eyebrow in response. Konoha needs to be strong. You had the courage to die for Konoha, Yondaime. Sama. You must now muster the courage to live for it, he said, meeting the Yondaime's gaze. Kyuubi thinks that Naruto has a bigger role to play, that there's a destiny, a prophecy, the Yondaime said, shaking his head in disgust as he watched his teenage son wearily rub the bridge of his nose. That I still don't get, but the bastard swore an oath in the name of Inari, so I know that he isn't lying. He can't lie under such a powerful oath or Inari will have his head. With doubt, Minato questioned, a prophecy? He pointed roughly at the sky and said, yeah, don't ask me. This just goes to prove that those bastards up there have shit for brains. Pointing to his stomach, he said, we're going to use the same seal. I'm going to perform it instead of you. I think you're forgetting your place, Captain. Minato replied icily, I am the Hokage. What made you think that I'll agree to this? He got a cool look from Naruto that Minato knew he would later despise. He learned a lot from that specific look. It informed him that nothing could stop Naruto from completing his mission. Minato never wanted to see that cold, unyielding determination to complete a task at any cost in his son's eyes. He didn't want anyone else to suffer because he was aware of how Kakashi was affected. "There's a chance that I'll survive," Naruto clarified. "I have 2 souls within me. The jutsu will tax me, doubtlessly. It will be painful, of that I've no doubt, but there is a chance that I'll survive where you definitely would not." Minato frowned. He knew Naruto had a point, but he was hesitant to give in. He leaned forward and said, "I still don't want you to do this." His tone subtly changed, becoming more severe and authoritative. "Even if I die, there are many people who'd look after my son. And you can prevent whatever you want to prevent from happening. You already know what is going on, so." Naruto narrowed his eyes and questioned, "You don't get it, do you? Konoha needs Yondaime Hokage. Sandaime isn't fit to take over the position anymore. Naruto needs his father, not some replacement." Minato softened her gaze and said, "Naruto, please, please," pleaded the younger gentleman, "let me do this. If I do this, we can secretly seal Kyuubi away even before it reaches Konoha and no one will be wiser. Everyone who knows that it is approaching would just assume that it vanished somewhere." He raised his hand dismissively. "There's something going on here that both you and I don't understand. You know of it, Jiraiya. Sensei has told you of it. There's a storm coming, father." They were in a tense silence while Minato gazed at Naruto. A feeling of awkwardness pervaded the atmosphere. The word, father, hovered between them, adding feelings to a conversation that was devoid of them. Minato abruptly burst out laughing, and Naruto began to stare at him with wide eyes. And in the same breath, "You ask me to let you sacrifice your life in place of mine?" he asked, whispering as he ran a trembling hand through his hair. "You call me father. I have my supposed son sitting in front of me saying that he is willing to die. Another who is going to be born tomorrow, not knowing that the first thing his father would do for him would be to seal a demon within him." Naruto hesitated, his regal features marred by a frown. "Yondaime, Sama." With a confused expression, Yondaime said, "You want me to choose between a father's duty and a Hokage's. How do I do that? Everything was going so perfectly." Minato replied softly, "We won the war with stone. Peace was finally at our door. Step. I fulfilled my life. Long dream of being the Hokage. Kushina agreed to marry me and I was over the moon. Then she said that she was pregnant and I felt as though no one was happier than I was. But this I did not anticipate. I did not anticipate Kyuubi's arrival hanging like a death sentence over my family." Naruto winced. Minato closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. The Hokage straightened his posture and fixed Naruto with his piercing gaze before saying, "All right. Why should I agree?" At least his father was thinking about it. Naruto sighed. He observed that he was now perfectly composed as he looked at the Hokage. "Your death is not acceptable. Please understand that. So many things would fall into place if I just do this. There are factors that you can't even begin to understand. There are people out there who could bring Konoha to its knees and we need a strong leader. There was no one where I came from." Naruto clenched his hand with rage. "Trust me, please." For a long time, Minato watched him, her blue eyes unreadable. He looked hesitant to agree and finally said, "Very well." Minato turned away from Naruto's brilliant smile of relief, hoping that everything would work out. A low voice asked, "Are you ready?" Minato sighed and said, weakly, "I don't know, sensei." He already had the impression that things were getting worse. He grinned painfully as he looked down at the tiny, silent bundle in his arms. "Kushina," he whispered brokenly, "they say that she might not make it." He said quietly, "Obstetrical hemorrhage, she's bleeding too heavily." Jiraiya sighed, "They're trying everything they can." "He's beautiful," Yondaime whispered, "and I know he would grow up to be an excellent man." He smiled and stroked Naruto's pink, pudgy cheek. With a sneer, Jiraiya turned his head to glance at the teenage boy who was carefully studying a scroll. "Beautiful is right. As far as physical features go, he surely looks like he could be your son. He looks like Kushina as well. If you ignore his coloring, you can see more of Kushina in him. If this is a ruse, it's a brilliant one." The Yondaime nodded. A full analysis was done on his blood. They used every trick in the book to see if Naruto was lying, sensei. I even had Inoichi do a mind walk on the boy. Both his DNA and the results from Inoichi say that he's my son. He glanced at the Gamma Sennin. They ran the DNA test 3 times just to be sure. Jiraiya glanced at the supposed son of his student and, good to have some rational proof as well. "Still, there are some eerie resemblances in your gestures, Minato. His chakra feels like Kushina's. And what's with that ridiculously long hair? I guess he inherited that from Kushina as well. It certainly doesn't resemble your rat's nest. With a smile on his face, Minato said, his hair was just like mine before he grew it out. That has nothing to do with Kushina and everything to do with you. He was holding an older version of the baby. Me? Jiraiya asked, looking at his pupil in astonishment. The Sennin arched a brow, and because he had learned Hari Jizo from the notes you left him as an inheritance. The Yondaime laughed. Apparently, he grew his hair out to honor your memory. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes at Minato and said, has he seen Kushina? Before shrugging and saying, not that I mind. Long hair isn't exactly necessary for that. His pupil admitted, yeah. He's more upset over Kushina's condition than he would like to admit. He softly replied, he came here to save his family as well as the village. The possibility that he might lose her before he has a chance to know her pains him. The Hokage nodded his head. I think that a son would always be attached to his mother whether he knows her or not. Seeing those pale features and the boy's white, knuckled grip on the scroll, Jiraiya scowled. He looks nervous. Minato, will he be able to perform the seals? You say that he used Hidotoki no Kami Fuin but... With a frown, Minato looked at the scroll Naruto was holding and said, I don't want to doubt his skills but sealing is such an obscure art and requires so much time and dedication. I don't know if he will be able to do it. I fear that something may go wrong. Minato nodded. I worry about that as well. His sharp blue eyes were thoughtful as he observed his teenage son. Jiraiya and Minato turned around in mild surprise as a wise voice interrupted them, saying, there are some who are younger than us but far more skilled. Jiraiya nodded, and Minato also greeted Sandaime, saying, Sensei. This is your son we are talking about, Minato, Sandaime said with a chuckle, looking down at the sleeping baby in Minato's arms. You were younger than he is now when you first joined the Konoha Iwa War, and most would say that we won the war because of you. I don't think we can afford to underestimate anyone who has the Namikaze and the Uzumaki blood running through his veins. The older man reached forward and stroked the baby Naruto's cheek, saying, I trusted you with a great responsibility when you were barely older than him, nodding at the teenager. With his gaze fixed on the boy, Minato turned to observe him making brief notes on paper while muttering to himself. He was acting with a sense of urgency. A feeling of forcefulness that suggested Naruto was using it as a diversion from more unpleasant thoughts. It was impossible to hide the intense pain in Naruto's eyes as he watched Kushina fight for her life. That was the last straw for Minato. It was obvious evidence that Naruto was, in fact, both Kushina's and his son. It hurt to see Naruto grasp Kushina's hand while gazing at her with intense desire on his face. His son had been an orphan, he reminded him. Minato wanted to eliminate the guilt he saw in Naruto's eyes before it had a chance to establish itself. He didn't know him well enough to be consoling, though. He was unable to persuade Naruto that he was not at fault. That in all of this chaos, he was the only real innocent. As he turned to face Sandaime, a gentle voice said, it's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult to know that you're his father yet know that you didn't raise him, that you couldn't protect him. Minato nodded and sighed, but before he could say anything, a Junin entered the room and began to stare at the Hokage impatiently. Yondaime. Sama, he exclaimed, it's the Kyuubi. Naruto nodded to Minato as he snapped his head in his direction. All right, we're prepared for this. Have the civilian escorted to the evacuation bunkers. All senior Junin and Chunin are to apply themselves to the defense of the village. With a nod, the Junin hurried out of the room. The young Namikaze glanced at his predecessor and nodded, saying, you know what to do, sir. The Hokage directed the ANBU who always followed him as his guard to come forward, saying, gather ANBU primary offense units 1 to 4. They'll be accompanying Sandaime. Sama. In case we fail, Sandaime. Sama is our only chance. Gently, Sarutobi replied, of course. Minato turned back to the ANBU and said, emergency protection units 8 and 9 will be with Jiraiya. Sama. Keep doing constant sweeps of the village to ensure that no intruder slips in. Naruto raised his voice for the first time, saying, I suggest we take the primary defense detail with us. They have the best shield experts. Before giving Sandaime and Jiraiya a Hireishin, tagged Kunai, Minato said, very good. He then gave it to the ANBU. Give this to Tanaka. He's appointed to guard my wife. Tell his to stay by her side, no matter what happens. That's all, you may leave. With a swift and silent departure, the ANBU bowed. You should leave. Jiraiya responded, if we delay any longer, Kyuubi would come too close to our borders. After giving his baby son to Naruto with caution and nodding, Minato bent down and kissed his forehead. Naruto nodded curtly, clumsily rolling up the scrolls in front of him while holding the baby in one hand. Minato's eyes widened at the intricate work when he saw the final seal design. Nothing was out of place because Naruto had been so careful, and the Hokage momentarily questioned whether even he could achieve such perfection. It was clear that his child had inherited his mother's abilities. The primary defense detail quickly surrounded the Hokage, who had left the tower first. Naruto trailed behind, concealing the child in his arm with his big, heavy coat. There was a noticeable feeling of apprehension and fear as they passed through the village. The Hokage was urgently called out by numerous civilians, but Minato disregarded them all. His gaze was fixed on the hideous thing that was now demolishing the gates of Konoha. Naruto muttered angrily, "Shit, we're too late." Minato said coldly, "That's not a problem." Then, in a faint, nearly imperceptible flash, he bounded forward. As their Hokage rushed forward, the ANBU group that accompanied them appeared confused and frightened. After muttering a curse, Naruto made a makeshift sling out of his coat and securely tucked the infant inside. He looked at the ANBU with a scowl. "Don't run about like headless chickens. Split up. 4 with me and 2 with Yondaime. Inform him that I'm at the shrine. He knows where. Go now." Naruto's voice was so powerful and commanding that they automatically obeyed his commands. With incredible speed, Naruto sped past the tense villagers and ninjas. It was difficult for the ANBU followers to keep up. As the man faced the Kyuubi, he sped past Yondaime, keeping the infant in his protective arms and trying not to attract the beast's attention. It was for nothing. Kyuubi immediately detected Naruto's powerful chakra and the faintest trace of its own evil strength. The Biju's Sharingan eyes instantly focused on Naruto as it turned in his direction. Sensing the huge attack that Kyuubi preferred coming at him, Naruto didn't bother to stop. He was completely confident in Yondaime's abilities. "Be careful," the Hokage yelled, emerging from behind Naruto. He swallowed Kyuubi's Bijudama attack and allowed the time space portal to form using his special Hiraishin Kunai. After being carried to a safe location where no one could be harmed, the big black ball of power vanished without a trace. Minato exclaimed, "Kachiyose no Jutsu," as Naruto sped forward, disregarding everything that was happening behind him. He had to prepare the infant for sealing. Yondaime yelled, "Naruto, the shrine." Naruto loudly said, "Hi," and then performed his own rendition of Hiraishin. He vanished from view as a protective chakra shroud encased him. "Sorry Bunta." Minato turned to face the Kyuubi. The Toad Boss simply grunted when he was called upon directly on top of Kyuubi. "Just hold him down a moment. I'll need a lot of chakra to transport Kyuubi." With a harsh tone, the Toad summon said, "Don't take too long." Minato used a powerful chakra burst to carry the Biju out of the village before anyone could react. Minato's breath caught in his throat when he saw his wife for the first time in the shrine. From a distance, he could see that she had a stubborn light in her eyes despite her appearance of weakness and pallor. "Kushina-san," Naruto begged, "you need to go back to the hospital. It isn't safe here. Yondaime. Sama and I'll handle it." As Kyuubi tried to attack his small family, Minato swore and tried to divert its attention. The presence of Kushina caused dread to begin coiling in his stomach. How were they to both keep the Kyuubi at bay and safeguard her? Minato wished his wife had not been such a strong kunoichi for once. "I know just what you and your father have planned and I'm not going to sit back and do nothing as my son sacrifices his life," Kushina's resounding voice answered. Naruto took a step back, her knowledge immobilizing her. It was not intended for her to be aware of him. In any case, how could she have recognized him at first glance? When he had visited her in the hospital, she had been unconscious. "Kushina," said Minato, "now's not the time to be stubborn. You're in no condition to fight." His wife ignored him. She was focused on the Kyuubi. The Biju was bound and pushed to the ground as her chakra bounded forward in the shape of chains. She refused to let anyone be harmed and was resolved to fulfill her own role. She turned and glared at her husband and her adult child once the beast had been somewhat tamed. "Minato, I don't know what you're thinking, but letting our son go forth with this suicidal scheme is foolishness." "Damn it, Kushina, we don't have time to argue." He stepped back and began performing some quick hand seals, saying, "I know exactly what I'm doing." "Mother," Naruto interrupted, his voice catching as he saw her drop to her knees. "Please return to the hospital." Bird, horse, snake, boar, ram, rabbit, dog, rat, and so on. Naruto released a tiny burst of chakra, and the Shinigami's massive figure materialized behind him. Between the Shinigami and Naruto, a sphere of intense light appeared, but it lacked a distinct shape. Kushina screamed in protest, but lacked the strength to move. While closely monitoring his infant son and his adult son, Minato hurried over to his weakening wife and helped her sit up. Naruto stated gravely, With Shiki Fujin, I'll be sealing away half of Kyuubi's power away forever. The other half, I'll seal within Naruto using Hake Fuin. Shiki Fujin won't work if you're already the host, Kushina yelled hoarsely, you fool. Naruto let out a terrifying roar as Kyuubi's enormous head jerked in his direction. Mother. He replied quietly, as long as I don't have that, he motioned to the big Biju. Kyuubi in me. I can perform Shiki Fujin. While it is true that a Jinchuriki can't perform Shiki Fujin, I'm an exception. The mere fact that a version of Kyuubi is inside me allows me to perform the jutsu and survive. As he examined the ball of unidentifiable light that Shinigami's hair had managed to trap, Minato narrowed his eyes. In terms of appearance, it did not resemble Naruto's soul or humanoid shape. Perhaps Naruto's scheme was working. Minato, Kushina grumbled weakly, please stop him. I can take Kyuubi into myself. That way you'll have some time before it regenerates. There is no need for this. He said quietly, you know we can't do that, Kushina. This is the only way. But he's our son. They're our sons. There has to be another way. We're doing this for Naruto, Minato yelled, then reached forward and gave her icy cheek a gentle pat. I feel like our child is in the middle of something horrible that's coming up, so we have to do this. Shiki Fujin. The two startled parents quickly turned to face Naruto as the boy landed on his knee. Kyuubi's yin chakra was mercilessly snatched away by the Shinigami's hand as it passed through him and directly at Kyuubi. Although the method appeared straightforward, Kyuubi's ability to shrink to half its former size was evidence of its effectiveness. The yin chakra clearly assumed the form of the Kyuubi and blended into the soul Shinigami had imprisoned. After hurling a series of curses, Naruto felt his chakra suddenly drain and struggled to catch his breath. But Kushina and Minato both appeared genuinely relieved. Naruto muttered urgently, I don't know how much longer I can stay conscious. Quick, place the baby on the ceremonial pedestal. With a nod, Minato set his baby boy down on the pedestal. But before they could complete the sealing, Kyuubi struck, exploiting Kushina's deteriorating condition. They all responded simultaneously, using their bodies to protect the infant. Despite passing through Minato's shoulder, Kushina's chest, and Naruto's stomach, Kyuubi's lone claw was unable to reach the real target of its wrath. There was no harm done to the child. Naruto ignored the pain that was numbing his mind and gritted his teeth. When the child began to cry, he comforted him by whispering, "Shh," in a painful tone. "Be brave, Naru-chan." He knelt down and collected his remaining chakra. In order to finish the task, he quickly and skillfully used the child's blood to draw seals onto his body. As the child whimpered, Naruto begged again, "Shh, please Naru-chan." He began creating hand seals as soon as he was done, whispering, "Hake no Fuin Shiki." He placed his fingers lightly on one of the 3 sets of runes and watched, his eyes blurry, as the seal came to life and began to function. Using his rapidly dwindling chakra, he formed another set of hand seals and whispered, "Shisho Fuin." He took another trembling breath. Before fatigue overcame him, all he saw when his task was finished was a flash of light in the child's happy face. Feeling the weight of his parents on his back, he staggered. Blackness threatened to engulf Minato, but his trembling arms held him aloft. With a feeble laugh, Naruto closed his eyes. It was completed. The idea of death was not new to Minato. Like any good ninja, he accepted it as a part of his life. It was inevitable, he knew. He was aware that it occasionally happened when one least expected it to. Everyone had to confront the inexorable force of death. Minato found it difficult to accept the terrible truth of his wife's passing despite being aware of all these facts. Initially, they had been rivals. After that, they developed a friendship. Respect and admiration followed friendship. And love followed. The majority of their lives had been devoted to their relationship. They had been acquainted since childhood. Together, they had endured innumerable hardships, supporting one another. He had lost Kushina, who had just recovered from giving birth when the Kyuubi killed her. Minato was numb. While grieving for his wife and keeping watch over a son who appeared to be near death, he fled from the world, unwilling to face his obligations. Many people came to express their sympathy for him. Others arrived to demand answers. Few reminded him that he had a job to do and interrupted his time of mourning. Some reminded him that Konoha needed its Hokage in an attempt to lift him out of his sorrow. Fortunately, Sandaime had taken care of the Hokage Tower's needs. Because of this, Minato was able to arrange the wake, the cremation, the closing of the Namikaze family shrine, and the opening of the family burial plot. It was an agonizing process, and he felt empty of all the condolences he received. It all made Minato numb. He observed his adult son's pale features while sitting by the time traveler's bed. As he dutifully cared for the baby under his supervision, he pondered why everything seemed so hopeless. Where has he put his will to live? Where had his enthusiasm for life gone? With Kushina's final, ragged breath, they appeared to have disappeared. Not only that, but the boy's health was also in doubt. He had a very stressed chakra circulatory system. He was alternating between high fevers and chills and had not yet recovered consciousness. Minato had no choice but to sit and watch as his body rapidly lost the fight. With a sigh, he lowered his head and rested it gently on the bed while he peered at his baby son. Taking into account the names of both his sons, he thought, this is going to be a problem. Nearly all of their acquaintances were aware that their son would be named Naruto. Furthermore, Jiraiya's novel served as the inspiration for the rather unusual name Naruto. The majority of his friends, his students, and a few council members were aware of it, but the Konoha general public was unaware. Suspicions would undoubtedly arise if the father gave his infant son a different name while allowing the boy to have his own. His goal was to make their story as convincing as possible. Particularly if he wanted to let everyone know that the time traveler was actually his brother. Finally, Minato had made up his mind about how he would tell the council why the boy was there. It was obvious to everyone that they were related, and Yondaime was aware that he couldn't be honest with them. He didn't want to put the boy through that because they were like vultures and would try to extract all of his knowledge about the future. It was still painful to talk about his mother, but it was the best solution Minato could think of. Despite being a kunoichi, Namikaze Akuho had been a kind mother. A stone kunoichi. Relationships between Konoha and Iwa were not a concern when she had married his father. They had been a happy family, and she had consented to leave her job in Iwagakure in order to settle in Konoha. Then Konoha and Iwa's relationship began to deteriorate, and his parents' arguments became more heated. At last, the delicate thread snapped, and his mother abandoned them. She didn't support Konoha, but she was also unable to rejoin Iwa. She just walked away from her son in the village. Minato was ready to make an excuse out of her. When she left, he was prepared to inform the council that the boy was his brother and that she was pregnant. In any case, his mother was no longer here to correct him. He sighed and glanced down at the inquisitive infant in his lap. He grinned and wriggled his fingers at his son, asking, "What do you think, Naru-chan? In your infinite wisdom, what would be the best name for your new uncle? He can't be called Naruto now, can he? That's your name. How about something close to Naruto, Naruki, perhaps?" The child asked, gurgling. Yondaime considered it absently, attempting to divert his attention from more upsetting topics. He looked at the boy on the bed and grinned, saying, "Or maybe, Naruhiko, could do as well, won't it? He does look like a prince, don't you think?" He tickled his son's belly and said, "And we're going to tease him mercilessly about that, aren't we?" His child laughed innocently. Yondaime laughed. "I personally like Naruaki. What do you think? Namikaze Naruaki. Sounds like a name the samurai of the old would have, doesn't it?" His thoughts were interrupted by a rough voice that said, "Yes, it does sound quite impressive, I should say." After turning around, Minato gave Jiraiya and Tsunade a nod. Tsunade simply nodded curtly, sweeping past the Yondaime and immediately starting to check on her patient. "I thought it would be best if we changed his name." "Tsunade has already changed the boy's blood report to show that he's your brother. Apparently, all she had to do was remove Kushina's name from the report," Jiraiya said, passing the file to Minato. "Sensei sent these forms." Tsunade snorted. "From the DNA standpoint, this brat is definitely your son, Minato." She said, "I checked and rechecked everything." She closed her eyes and focused on her patient's chakra system, saying, "He definitely has your wind chakra. His physical condition is excellent, even by shinobi standards. I am guessing that he has inherited the Uzumaki clan vitality." She turned to face the Hokage, saying, "He wouldn't have survived the ceiling if he didn't have a portion of Kushina's natural strength." Minato answered, "I was already convinced that he's my son, Tsunade-san." After giving a nod, the female Sannin resumed her work. After a long moment of staring at the boy on the bed, Jiraiya turned to Minato. "People are getting curious about him." He warned, "Sensei had asked you to fill up those forms as soon as possible. He suggested that the boy shouldn't take you last na." "No," Yondaime interrupted right away, saying firmly, "He'll be a Namikaze by blood as well as name." Something had informed Yondaime that the child should be named Namikaze when the boy had introduced himself. Instead of having the name as a birthright, the boy had declared himself in a way that suggested he had earned the right to use it. Jiraiya gave him the benefit of the doubt, but she only shrugged. He sat on an empty seat and watched Tsunade perform her miracle, saying, "I don't care much either way." He looked at his student and said, "But claiming that the boy was born after your mother left the village in order to support you would cast him in a suspicious light. Sensei informed me of your plan." Simple but effective. As he began to fill in the details, Minato noted, "Not if I tell them that he saved the village at great risk to his own life." He couldn't really afford to wait any longer, but he hoped the boy liked his new name. "Well, you better have some plausible explanation." Tsunade replied sternly, "And from what Jiraiya tells me, it's best we keep the knowledge of Naruto being a Jinchuriki to ourselves." Minato's expression darkened as he said, "Yes. Unlike Sama, I don't believe that anyone needs to know about this. I still can't understand why," without making a face at the memory of his predecessor. Since the people of Leaf shouldn't be kept in the dark about Naruto's status as a Jinchuriki, Sandame had insisted that they inform everyone. "Sensei thinks that they won't believe our alternate explanation and that would lead to fear and unrest amongst the populace." Jiraiya responded, "But I don't agree. That fear will dissipate over time. There's no need to risk Naruto's being such trivial things. Beside, the child will have enough on his plate. He doesn't need anything more." Minato gave a nod. Minato had used her power over Sandame for the first time. He had stated unequivocally that they would keep Naruto's condition private and that no one else would know about it. Minato resolutely declared, "Only we will be aware that Naruto is a Jinchuriki." "That's good." When they saw the boy carefully sit up with Tsunade's assistance, Minato and Jiraiya immediately turned to face the bed, their scowls dissolving with relief. The injured boy said softly, "Merely keeping that a secret would prevent many problems." He then turned to face Tsunade and bowed slightly, saying, "Thank you, Tsunade-san." After examining him intently for a considerable amount of time, Tsunade scoffing, "You seem just as problematic as your father, brat. You dragged me back to Konoha." "Well, this isn't the first time I've done that," he said, raising an eyebrow. The boy then turned to Minato and asked, "Is everything well?" He looked at the infant in the Hokage's arms and asked, "Is the child well, Yondaime-sama?" "Yes." Minato gave a nod. "We must discuss some important matters because the council and the villagers are still waiting for an explanation." "You managed to avoid them this long?" the younger boy asked, his raw voice tinged with disbelief. He raised a brow. "I was busy arranging your mother's funeral," Minato said with a sorrowful smile as she nodded. "She didn't," he whispered in horror as his eyes widened. Minato was about to respond when Tsunade interrupted, her tone brimming with direct professionalism. "From her medical reports, I gleaned that she was in a very delicate condition and needed complete rest. She defied the healer's orders and left the hospital. In the confrontation with Kyuubi, all three of you were stabbed with its claw. Minato's injury was relatively mild in comparison to yours and Kushina's. Kushina died instantly. You somehow managed to endure the pain and complete the sealing process." She looked at him with a slightly impressed expression. "It took me many hours to repair the damage. Your body was extremely stressed." Jiraiya laughed. "Stressed is an understatement. First the seal to travel back and you don't even allow yourself a moment's rest before you start working on how to safely seal away the Kyuubi. The very next day, you perform Shiki Fujin." He looked at him with disbelief. "I don't know how you pulled it off." Observing the boy's pale and appalled features with a worried frown, Minato nodded and sighed, whispering, "I would have liked to wait for you. As far as I'm concerned, you're my eldest son. You had the right to be there, but we were so uncertain when or if you were going to wake up. I couldn't delay it." Looking down at his younger self, the younger blonde shook his head and said, "It's all right." He watched the child smile at the air before him. "I'm just glad everything worked out in the end." "Yes. Me too." Minato sighed and leaned back in his chair. "We realized that it would be best if your name was changed. I thought that something close to your original name would be comfortable to you. How does Naruaki sound?" he said, looking directly into his older son's eyes. "Of course, I should have realized," the teenager said, shaking his head after giving Yondaime a startled look. "Yes, I don't think it would be too hard to adjust to that. It does sound like Naruto. Besides, there would be a lot of confusion if we both had the same names." The newly christened Naruaki smirked and pointed to baby Naruto, saying, "The world is not big enough to hold two Naruto at the same time." As Jiraiya and Minato laughed, Tsunade sneered, "Well, that's settled. I've thought out a background story as well." "Background story?" asked the ANBU, raising an eyebrow. Nodded, "We can't tell the council or the villagers that you just traveled back in time, can we? And I can't say that you aren't related to me. Unfortunately, us Namikaze have very distinctive features and you look a lot like me." Minato gazed at Naruaki's eyes. "I'm going to tell them that you're my brother. My mother left Konoha somewhere around 17 years ago. My parents' marriage failed and she left. I can tell them that she was pregnant when she left." Naruaki sighed. "Yondaime-sama, you do realize that I'm 18 years old and if she..." Minato nodded. I know. You do not mind lying about your age, do you? No one will be able to tell the difference if you claim that you are 16 instead of 18. That's true. Tsunade continued, paying close attention to Naruaki. Age isn't something that can be guessed at so accurately just by looking at a person, after all. A difference of 2 or 3 years wouldn't be noticeable. The younger Namikaze gave it some thought and cocked his head to the side. I guess that shouldn't be a problem. And how do we explain it? They want to know how we got rid of Kyuubi. Before that, Tsunade spoke up, we need to do something about the markings on your cheek. It's best to remove as many similarities between you and Naruto as possible. I can remove those markings if you agree. Naruaki ran a hand over his cheek, stroking the lines that adorned his face. He knew that he had been born with him. Their appearance was not a result of Kyuubi being sealed into him. However, he had no sentimental attachment to them at all. He gave Tsunade a nod, letting her glowing hand gently touch his cheeks and erase those marks. Minato observed the process curiously as he answered Naruaki's question. This is where we get to twist the truth around a bit. I'm going to tell them that Kyuubi was heading towards Konoha and we decided to take preliminary action against it. Since Kyuubi appeared rather abruptly in the middle of the village, I'm guessing someone must have summoned it. We can explain that our preliminary actions failed because it was summoned directly. Tsunade and Jiraiya gave grim nods of agreement. But Naruaki did not respond. The Yondaime took a close look at the child. This is where you get credibility in Konoha. I'm going to say that you're the one who sealed away the Kyuubi, which is the truth. I'm also telling them that you almost died in the process, which is true as well. We have to tell them about Kyuubi being sealed in Naru-chan, do we? Sighed Naruaki, stroking his hair. Minato smirked slightly and said, not necessarily. You did a good job of hiding Naruto from prying eyes when you took him to the shrine. You do know that sealing is an obscure line of study, right? There are hardly any Fuinjutsu experts in Konoha. I know only 3. Minato took in Naruaki's questioning look. Naruaki raised his eyebrows in disbelief. Only 3? In my time, there was Nara Shikamaru, Kakashi, Sensei, Jiraiya, Sensei and 4 others that I don't know the names of. I was of the second highest grade amongst us, of course, since I could perform A-class and S-class seals. Minato looked perplexed. Why, I guess Fuinjutsu gained popularity. He sighed, by 3, I mean, Jiraiya. Sensei, you and I there is one seal. The soul binding seal that would have worked on Kyuubi but I didn't want to risk it. He sighed, the soul binding seal is powerful. It calls a favor from Shinigami too but the consequences, grimaced, if the caster isn't strong enough then he gets sent to hell to suffer eternal torment. That is worse than Shinigami's stomach. Precisely, Minato replied, they don't know this and they'd never understand the intricacies of a seal as complex as that. If we tell them you were strong enough, mentally and spiritually, to successfully cast the seal, they'll have no choice but to believe it. The healers can vouch that you suffered from chakra exhaustion. Add to that, your nearly lethal injury and my own testimony, we'd have enough proof. With wide eyes, Naruaki shook his head in shock and said, that's quite a plan, Yondaime-sama. Yes, well, I had time to Alright, since everything had been discussed and agreed upon, you need to leave. The brat needs his rest and he can't do that with you 2 morons trying to disturb him, Tsunade said sharply, interrupting Minato. With a laugh, Jiraiya took his infant godson out of Minato's embrace and said, come on Minato, she'd right. The Yondaime followed Jiraiya out of the room after nodding and giving Naruaki a troubled look. After a long period of silence between the 2 strong ninja, Jiraiya couldn't help but voice his thoughts. He's rather formal and distant. He noticed, looking at Minato, he addresses you as Yondaime-sama, rather pointedly, doesn't he? And adding a san to Tsunade's name, that was almost awkward. He's intentionally trying to keep his distance. He's an orphan, doesn't know how to behave when he suddenly finds a father, Minato said with a smile despite his somewhat dejected expression. You aren't exactly ready to be a teenager's father either, Minato, Jiraiya said as he cast a perceptive glance at his pupil. With a sigh, the Hokage lowered his head slightly and said, we need time, both of us need time. After observing him for a considerable amount of time, the Gamma Sennin nodded, okay. After what ended up being an extremely traumatic day, Minato sighed and took a brief break to sip warm, revitalizing tea. Only a day after he woke up, Naruaki was released from the hospital. Minato had to sit in his office and handle paperwork while his son could go home and unwind. The hunter Nin had been with them when his ANBU finally arrived and demanded an explanation. Kakashi was upset that Yondaime hadn't brought him along and had also demanded an explanation. It was simple to place the hunter Nin in the ANBU. but Kakashi had been devastated because he was afraid of losing another team member. He also had to contend with Naruaki's propensity to make abrupt, cryptic remarks. The Uchiha clan is a part of the village too. Try to integrate them into the politics of Konoha before you regret alienating them. Yondaime rubbed his nose bridge. Incorporating that clan into village politics was easy for him. Because of the Uchiha's strength, the police helped to keep the village in order. He was also aware that the rivalry between the Senju and Uchiha clans was the reason why Shodame and Naidame had alienated them. He was aware that Sandame had chosen to ignore the fact and not worry about it. But Minato had no intention of disregarding his son's caution. The implication of Naruaki's remark was that the Uchiha clan might rebel. That would rock Konoha to its core if that occurred. He had to treat the situation carefully. Although Uchiha Fugaku, the head of the Uchiha clan, was already a member of the council, his influence was, at most, limited. Fugaku's influence paled in comparison to Hyuga Hiyoshi's power. Minato knew that the Uchiha were particularly troubled by that. Minato had been thinking about the situation with Homura, Kaharu, and Danzo prior to Naruaki's arrival and Kyuubi. Minato was wary because of their unmatched authority in the council. They had spent too much time in the position of authority. They tended to view Sandame as a child playing an adult's game because they were his advisors. Although Minato found their contemptuous behavior bothersome, he was more worried about the power being directed towards their heads. They had grown too self-assured and never thought twice about using their power to achieve their personal goals. Danzo was also a living danger. Minato was aware of his continued desire to be the Kage. He came up with a plan that would accomplish two goals at once, but he wanted to speak with Naruaki first. His thoughts on the subject would be very helpful, and he had to act quickly because he had a 2-hour meeting with the council. Still figuring out the specifics of his plan, he silently called an ANBU to the office. He began to write down a rough outline of his plans, but he still felt that they were incomplete. He had no desire to discuss the matter with Sandame. The old Hokage was too much of a pacifist to handle the situation appropriately, despite his wisdom. The ANBU saluted. "Hokage Sama." Minato gave him a nod, grateful for the prompt reply. Looking up at the bird. "Masked ANBU," he said, "run an errand for me, would you? I need you to go to my house and ask my brother, Namikaze Naruaki, to come here as soon as possible." The ANBU didn't show signs of confusion if he was taken aback by the unexpected appearance of a brother who had never existed before. All he did was bow and say, "Hi," and he was gone. Ignoring a pile of papers on the desk's corner that needed to be read and signed, Minato focused on a report in front of him. Jiraiya's request for Tsunade to provide him with a thorough report on Naruaki's condition and treatments pleased him. Minato would present it to the council if needed as evidence that the boy had actually sealed the Kyuubi. Given that Tsunade had explicitly stated that Naruaki's chakra capacity was enormous, one wouldn't experience such a severe case of chakra exhaustion by doing nothing. Kyuubi was a completely different story. When Naruaki stated that it would be ideal if they began Naruto's training as soon as possible, he was being entirely serious. The boy had claimed that the naive Konoha residents, who had no knowledge of seals, would accept the justification they had devised. It wouldn't work on people who know everything that there is to know about the Jinchuriki and the Biju, Naruaki had stated. "You look troubled." Minato sensed Naruaki's approach before she even raised her head from the report. "Sit down, there's something I need to discuss with you." Raising an eyebrow, Naruaki said, "I thought that we were done with that." With his fingers clasped in front of his mouth, Minato shook his head and said, "No, this is a different matter." He gazed at his teenage son and said, "Before the Kyuubi came up, I was dealing with a problem." "Problem?" scowled Naruaki, who was leaning back and crossing his legs. He still felt a little weak, so he was hoping to get some sleep. But sleep would have to wait, it appeared. Minato asked directly, "How much do you know about Homura, Kaharu, and Danzo?" When he saw Naruaki's eyes flashing with anger, he scowled, but the boy quickly controlled it, and his face once again showed no signs of his thoughts. "Why do you ask?" the younger Namikaze said softly, cupping his face with one hand in a rather casual gesture. "I know many things." "Well, do you know that all three of them have been in power ever since Sandame Hokage took over? They're the true council." Minato responded and Naruaki nodded, slightly perplexed. "Over the years, their power has been growing and their influence over the general council is getting stronger. Now, that wouldn't have been a problem, but you want to do something to curb their power?" Naruaki concluded for him, "But they are misusing that power." Nodded. "I've come up with a plan, but I wanted to discuss it with you since you made a comment on the Uchiha clan this morning." As his son's eyes widened, he raised his hand with confidence. "I'm not going to ask you for any details. I know you'll tell me what I need to know if you think it's wise to do so. I trust you with this. I just want to make sure that my actions do not have any adverse effects. I'm hardly the person to ask anything related to Konoha politics, Naruaki said softly. I just know how to follow orders and get the work done. I can't see how I can be of any help. Minato narrowed his eyes and said, Don't take me for a fool. Did you think I wouldn't notice? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Notice? Naruaki asked, a little taken aback by his father's abrupt tone. Minato frowned and said, When you first came here, you were in a uniform. He looked at Naruto, who was wearing a casual leaf green turtleneck sweater and blue jeans. I saw you wearing the captain's white cloak, but that wasn't the only thing I saw. He pointed to Naruaki's covered arm and said, I saw the faint silver lining that your ANBU tattoo had. You were one of the Hokage's highest-ranking ANBU. You were the general of the ANBU forces. Naruaki's eyes widened, and Minato shook his head in mild disbelief. I don't know how you got that rank at such a young age, and I won't ask. There's something very suspicious about it, but I trust you'll tell me when you feel you can. All right, I concede. What's the plan? The boy said softly as he cocked his head to the side and narrowed his eyes at Yondaime. Minato sighed and relaxed. You must know the village council consists of heads of all ninja families. Therefore, the general council is very large and the distribution of power between them, unequal. Danzo, Kaharu and Homura have the most influence because they are my personal council. I was thinking that I need something to check their power. And how do you think you can do that? Asked Naruaki, raising an eyebrow. I would be removing them from their position and appointing a new advisory body instead. The members would remain on the body for 5 years before a new group is selected. Those who are selected once will have to wait 10 years before they are taken into consideration for the post once again. I think that would work to curb the concentration of power. The advisory body will check my power and the constant rotation will check theirs. I had already procured the daimyo's permission for this. That is quite a sound plan. So all members of the General Council get a chance to be in power and be a part of the Hokage's council? Asked Naruaki, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. Nodded. Yes, however, the body won't just contain the members of the council. It'll have 5 members. 1 council member that I select, 1 member that the council selects, the ANBU general, the general of the Hunter Nin and a civilian representative. The only members of the body that will be able to stay for more than 5 years would be the generals. They will stay as long as they hold their positions in the ANBU. Naruaki gave a thoughtful nod. Including the ANBU and the Oinin is a very good idea. ANBU are very loyal and the Oinin are well aware of what goes on outside the village. They'll be of great assistance when it comes to negotiations. I suggest that for civilian representative, you chose one of the full-time doctors of Konoha Hospital for the first round. They aren't ninjas since they're purely in the medical field, but they're used to dealing with ninja and the civilians both. They're likely to be more understanding of the workings of the village and more loyal to you than an ordinary civilian would be. A doctor? Minato asked, cocking his head to the side with a puzzled frown on his face. Chuckling, since they're exposed to ninja in their most fragile states, they don't think of us as higher beings. Moreover, we don't easily intimidate them either. Using their skills with chakra manipulation, they can possibly disable some of the threats to their lives, though they may not be as skilled in fighting as the medic nin are. In addition, they're in contact with civilians on a regular basis and quite aware of their problems. He leaned forward and sighed. Don't, for even a single moment, think that Danzo wouldn't try to buy support in this new body. I think if this plan is implemented, the one representative selected by the council from amongst themselves will most likely be in Danzo's pocket. The civilian representative would be the weak link that he will exploit, if not by money then by fear. A doctor, who is paid almost as well as a full-fledged ANBU captain is paid, won't be too tempted by money, nor will he be intimidated by ninja easily. Minato's eyes widened as Naruaki gave his explanation. Moreover, doctors will look at aspects that a ninja would ignore. Things like education of civilians who aren't interested in becoming a ninja, the health and well-being of the village, the infrastructure, the proper functioning of the hospital, directing proper funds to the science and research facilities and such. These are important factors that matter to civilians while we only concentrate on bringing in income and providing security. Minato reclined, somewhat astounded by Naruaki's realization. With a nod of approval, he assured himself that he would investigate the possible applicants among the Konoha Hospital's permanent medical staff. Am I correct in assuming that you're contemplating selecting Uchiha Fugaku as the representative of your choice from the council? Asked Naruaki, his piercing eyes narrowed as he looked questioningly at Minato. Replied, I've nothing against the Uchiha, and since you mentioned in the morning about it, I've been thinking. The Uchiha do have a rather dubious reputation amongst the ninja, even if the civilians are very fond of them. If you meant to imply what I think you did, he pointedly glanced at Naruto, who merely raised brow in reply. I think bringing the Uchiha into a position of power now would be a good move. Besides, he is the head of the police force. He'd be a good addition. He knows what goes on in the village well, and Fugaku is almost as shrewd a man as Hyuga Heishi is. After giving a nod of comprehension, Naruto abruptly scowled and asked, speaking of the Uchiha, how old is Uchiha Itachi right now? The sudden question caused Minato to look at him bewildered. 5, I think, he trailed off unsurely. Is there a reason why you ask? With a grimace and conflicted, crystal blue eyes, Naruto whispered to himself, a damn good reason. Yondaime heard him, though. Naruto leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered, that idiot. He could still remember the moment he had faced Sasuke. Danzo had him killed the last time he had seen his rival and best friend. XOX with his heart pounding hard in his chest, Naruto yelled, Sasuke. What the hell do you think you are doing? As he witnessed the Uchiha aiming his blade at Utatane Kaharu. Naruto almost faltered as Sasuke hissed, his voice tight with rage, stay out of this. He rushed forward and caught Sasuke in a joint lock by using all of his speed. Naruto, Sasuke snarled alertly. Kaharu looked at Sasuke with a blank expression on her face, and Naruto narrowed his eyes at her. It wasn't far from the truth that she thought Naruto would defend her no matter what. From Naruto's perspective, Kaharu was a council member and Sasuke was the traitor. Although respectfully, Naruto commanded, Utatane Sama, please leave. He gritted his teeth and tightened his grip in a cool, businesslike tone. Sasuke went white with rage as she nodded and walked away. Pumping chakra into his arms to make sure they were powerful enough to hold Sasuke, Naruto kicked his fallen sword away from them. What are you up to, Teme? Said Naruto. You killed Itachi, there's still a chance that you may get pardoned. Come back to the village. The Uchiha tensed, and Naruto screamed in agony as he stumbled and fell to his knees due to electric shocks. Sasuke said in a low, menacing voice, pardoned? Naruto shook his head to get rid of the buzz in his ears and tried to control his body's trembling. With a cold sneer, he picked up his sword and let its sharp edge fall on Naruto's delicate neck skin. You think I want to be pardoned? He asked. You don't know anything. Then tell me what I need to know, said Naruto, looking up at Sasuke in frustration. Tell me why you're here, supporting the Akatsuki, letting it destroy our village. How can you hate Konoha so much? After giving him a snort, Sasuke turned and left him. The Uchiha paused and narrowed his eyes, saying, Itachi was right. Naruto asked, almost to himself, he asked me if I would be able to choose between you and Konoha. Sasuke turned around and said, I told him that I would save both. He seemed pleased then, why would he? Why, he said, looking up and meeting Sasuke's gaze. Unless there's something else about him that I don't know, something that made you look at Kaharu with such hate in your eyes, tell me. Sasuke, what did Konoha do? Naruto's eyes widened as Sasuke's lips curled into a grim smirk and he stepped forward, asking, you really want to know? Do you? You, who thinks the world of Konoha and its people and respects it, would you like to know how despicable that village is? Don't make assumptions, Sasuke. I have seen Konoha at its worst. I have seen the capacity for cruelty that its people have, Naruto said, standing up straight and wearing a serious expression. As Naruto's eyes widened, Sasuke smirked cruelly and said, what if I told you that Itachi was ordered to kill my clan by Homura, Kaharu, and Danzo? He stepped forward once more and asked, what if I told you that Itachi loved Konoha so much that he gave up his entire family for it, killed his entire family for it? His eyes were piercing deep into Naruto's clouded blue, jaded black eyes. What if I told you that he loved me so much that he couldn't kill me, despite the orders? That he let me believe that he was a criminal, making sure that I was strong enough to kill him with my own hands so that he could pay for his sins? What sins, huh? He inquired roughly. What sins had my brother committed, Naruto? Do you have the answer to that? Sasuke, Naruto muttered, doubtful. That was not what he had anticipated. You claim that you're my best friend, you claim that you thought of us as brothers. Sasuke said, wielding his sword, you told Itachi that you'd save both Konoha and I am asking you, Naruto, between me and those corrupt, heartless bastards, who would you choose? Naruto closed his eyes and winced. Sasuke grumbled, you are just like him. He grumbled, just like Itachi, just like your father. Just as Itachi couldn't kill me, you can't. You won't. And just as your father gave up his life for Konoha, you would. Without a moment of hesitation, you would. I chased after Itachi for years, thinking he was a traitor. You chased after me for years, knowing I am one. Naruto winced. I was able to kill him, he said. Will you be able to kill me? His lips curled into a grim smirk. I guess not. Being brothers isn't that great, is it? Sasuke said, looking up as Naruto went pale and his smirk deepened. Maybe next time you can try, alright. The Uchiha whispered as he collected chakra, while Sasuke stood in front of him, inserting 2 fingers into Naruto's forehead. Sorry, I've something important to do. Naruto gave way to the pain and jerked to his knees. As his consciousness waned, the last thing he saw was Sasuke standing over him, his face grave. Next time, I promise, Yuto. XOX. The memory caused Naruaki's eyes to darken, and in an attempt to block out the agony of those memories, he ran his fingers through his hair, pulling the strands roughly. Sasuke never had the opportunity to fulfill that commitment, did he? Danzo killed him after stealing it from him. The younger Namikaze looked up and shook his head to clear his mind before asking, Naruaki? Are you alright? Is there something wrong? With Uchiha Itachi? With a hollow, heavy laugh, Naruaki waved his hand dismissively. Before getting to his feet, he muttered roughly, forget it. That's something I'll deal with personally. Pardon me, he said, shaking his head and rubbing the bridge of his nose. I have a headache. Nar, the young ANBU interrupted quietly, saying, you can handle this. The rest can wait. You need to be present at the council meeting, he hissed, the rest can wait, but immediately recoiled in remorse. Stiffly, he pressed the heel of his palm against his temple and whispered, Father, please, let me go. Go get some rest, okay? I can't excuse you from the council meeting, so you have about an hour and a half of rest before it starts, Minato said, sighing and narrowing his eyes in concern. With a curt nod, Naruaki vanished from view. Minato let out a quiet groan as he felt his body's tension release. At times, his son's presence could be extremely oppressive. At times, he thought he understood Naruaki's overall personality, but the boy would do something that made him disregard that understanding. He shook his head and returned his focus to his work. In his spare time, he would solve the problem of Naruaki. Minato put the official version of his plans on paper, practiced by months of being the Hokage. He used every word carefully, ensuring that the proposal was presented in a way that would prevent misunderstandings. He was confident that the bill would be easily passed by the council. Only the individuals who were being fired from their jobs are likely to protest. Danzo, Homura, and Kaharu, that is. His lips formed a tiny smirk. He had had good reason to be suspicious of Danzo. It was clear from Naruaki's words that he was a man to observe. Minato was determined to observe him. Uchiha Mikoto gave the infants in front of her a gentle coo. She believed that Sasuke would benefit from some fresh air because he appeared a little restless. She had brought the Hokage's son with her because she couldn't abandon him. In addition, the park was a nice spot for kids. Naruto seemed happy to just yawn and gaze at the clouds, but Sasuke's adorable wide black eyes were fixed on everything. Mother, Mikoto said, glancing down at Itachi as her oldest daughter let Sasuke grip his finger. Why are we here? She asked. With her fingers running through his hair, Mikoto gave her solemn child a loving smile and said, I thought both Sasuke-kun and Naruto-kun could use some fresh air. She prodded him in the forehead and said, and you too. Besides, your little brother would like to spend a little time with his Oni-san. Mikoto turned to face Naruto, who was now staring at her with his endless blue eyes, and wriggled her fingers at him, saying, you like it here, don't you Naruto-kun? Her only response was a cute yawn, and she laughed. She felt sympathy rising in her chest as she gazed at the Hokage's son. His soft blonde hair and stunning blue eyes made him an adorable baby. He would have been loved by Kushina. She whispered, I bet she misses you a lot, up in heaven. She reached forward and gave him a gentle peck on the cheek. I bet she is watching over you right now, like all mothers watch over their children. Mother. Itachi called out to her once more, and she gave him a curious look. Isn't that Yondaime? Sama's brother? He asked, pointing to a person. Mikoto frowned as he turned to face the man who was strolling slowly. The only time she had seen Yondaime's brother was while he was in the hospital, unconscious. While the poor man was busy planning his wife's funeral, Yondaime had called her there to ask if she could watch his son. She initially thought Itachi had erred, but upon seeing him in the hospital, she understood that she had misjudged the length of his hair. Furthermore, he wasn't as pale as she had initially believed. He was tall and slender, and it surprised her that she had not initially thought of him as Yondaime's brother. They were strikingly similar in appearance. Namikaze-san, she exclaimed, glad that Yondaime wouldn't have to worry about his brother's safety at least. She watched as he glanced at her, nodded, and moved in their direction. Hello, my name is Uchiha Mikoto, and I am taking care of your nephew, Mikoto said with a smile, pointing to Naruto. "How are you feeling, Namikaze-san?" she asked. The man in front of her bowed his head elegantly and said, "Better, thank you for asking." She saw his cool blue eyes flicker between Sasuke and Itachi. When she saw her children, his eyes flashed with an emotion she couldn't comprehend, but his lips curled into a tiny smirk. He whispered, "And who are Naru-chan's new friends?" "It would be great if these 3 kids actually became close friends as adults," she said with a smile. "This is my oldest son, Itachi, and this," she said, placing a hand on her oldest son's shoulder. "That is my youngest son, Sasuke," she said, pointing to an inquisitive Sasuke. Smirking at the irony of it all, Naruaki knelt in front of the stroller that was carrying Sasuke and waved to the child, saying, "Hello, Sasuke-chan." If he had ever dared to call him that in front of him, Sasuke would have strangled him with joy. When he looked at Itachi, he realized at once that treating him like a child would be the biggest slight he had ever received. "Hello, Itachi-kun." He nodded elegantly, his eyes solemn and respectful. He was gazed at by those intense black eyes. He answered, "Hello, Namikaze-san." Naruaki was a little taken aback by the childlike tone of his voice. The smooth, low voice of the older Itachi had been almost expected. After observing the child for some time, he was certain that Uchiha Mikoto was unnerved by his intense attention to her eldest son. "This boy has seen the war, hasn't he?" he said softly as he looked at her and saw that she was biting her lip in doubt. He smiled wryly. The eyes were filled with a certain amount of fatigue, and he could see it now. This child was aware of the reality of their world. Mikoto gave a pitiful smile. It only took a glance for Yondaimi's brother to realize that he was a very perceptive person. Like all children of war, Itachi grew up quickly and was able to frighten a lot of people. But Itachi was different. She was aware of her son's exceptional intelligence, which further exacerbated the psychological effects of war on him. She placed a tender hand on Itachi's head and whispered, "Yes. He has." The Namikaze stood, his serious blue eyes piercing her son's ebony as he gazed down at Itachi. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Itachi-kun," he said. There was something in his eyes and voice that made Itachi straighten up. Mikoto was taken aback by the sudden display of intense respect in Itachi's eyes. She was taken aback when her son answered with a bow that was a little deeper than the ones he offered to the others. The gesture was subtle, something that only she could see in a son, but Naruaki's eyes sharpened, indicating that he had noticed it as well. The Namikaze then flashed a beautiful, wise smile. At that moment, she partially comprehended what was happening. Itachi was understood by Yondaimi's brother. In a single glance, he had been able to communicate to Itachi that he understood him in a way that no one else had attempted. Mikoto made the decision to keep that observation to herself even though she wasn't sure how she felt about it. He turned to face her, his handsome features adorned with a grin she had seen so often on Yondaimi's face. "I'm sorry that I can't take Naruto off your hands for now, Uchiha-san." He looked at his wristwatch. "I have only about an hour before I accompany Yondaimi-sama to a meeting with the council." Mikoto scowled at the way he spoke to his brother, a little perplexed by the formality, but she didn't give it much thought. She smiled and shook her head, saying, "It's okay. Naruto-kun isn't a bother at all." With a slight frown, he nodded to her and looked at his watch once more. "Oh, you do not mind if I leave your company early, do you?" he asked, giving her a rather disarming smile. "Hokage-sama has ordered me to take a break before the meeting," he said. "I tend to be a little irritable if I'm tired." In response to his shy smile, she shook her head and said, "Not at all. You must still be recovering from your chakra exhaustion, after all. I do hope you get well soon, Namikaze-san. Behave, alright? Don't give Uchiha-san any trouble." He turned to face the youngest Uchiha, and his smile turned amused. "I'll see you later, Sasuke-chan." He smirked when Sasuke reached out to grab his fingers, giggling. He nodded at her gratefully before bending down and fondly kissing his supposed nephew's cheek. It made him laugh to associate Sasuke with the word giggle. He was laughing uncontrollably in his head. He chuckled softly to himself, turned to face Itachi, and titled his head slightly in recognition while maintaining eye contact with the prodigy, Itachi-kun. In response, Itachi nodded and said, "Namikaze-san." Naruaki left with a faint smile on his face, his hair bouncing behind him as he went. Mikoto observed, a little perplexed and a little alarmed, as Itachi's gaze followed the man until he was no longer visible. She had been unnerved by Namikaze Naruaki. Even though his smile was friendly and as carefree as Yondaimi's, his presence was still a little intimidating. Maybe it was his eyes, which glowed with knowledge. Or maybe it was because he expected Itachi to grasp the nuances of silent conversations and treated him as he would an adult. Maybe it was the intense respect in Itachi's eyes for a man with whom he had barely spoken. It had been confusing, the way her child's eyes glowed with curiosity and the need to know. She had a feeling that Itachi would be permanently altered by that man's presence in his life. She simply was unable to determine whether it would be for the better or worse. Looking down at her son, she called softly, "Itachi-kun," asking, "What do you think of Namikaze-san?" Shrugging, Itachi said, "He is all right." Makoto scowled. Itachi's intensely focused eyes revealed that it was a rather casual response. Despite his intelligence, her son had not yet mastered the art of concealing his feelings from others. She was almost too good at reading him. Whatever Namikaze Naruto did, Itachi was able to notice. She had no answers to the question of what kind of relationship they would have going forward. She would have been even more wary of the Hokage's brother if she had seen the sly smile that appeared on Naruto's lips as he left them. Naruto deftly positioned himself in the shadows, paying close attention to every single person in the room. He was mostly focused on Danzo, of course. He was aware that the old man would have likely been suspicious if he had been visible because of the hatred in his eyes. Sandaime sat with Danzo, Kaharu, and Homura. Even though he obviously disagreed with their viewpoint on many issues, he thought it strange that the former Hokage would sit with them. He assumed Sandaime considered himself a member of their group because he was so accustomed to depending on them. Unexpectedly, Hyuga Heishi was seated next to Uchiha Fugaku. They both appear strong and noble. Naruto was unsure of her feelings toward the two men. He detested those who sought to manipulate the lives of others, and the 6 influential people he was examining frequently engaged in such behavior. He didn't have any illusions. It was Sandaime. His dad also did it. Too many times in his life, he had been a tool. The list continued for his father, Sandaime, Kyuubi, Danzo, and so on. Even though he detested it, it was unavoidable. He glanced absently at the other council members. Some of the faces he recognized were vaguely familiar, while others he was unable to identify. As he waited for the remaining members to settle in, his father sat at the head of the table, frowning thoughtfully. When they did, Homura made the decision to talk. "Yondaime Sama," he began, "it has been a week now since your unexplained order to evacuate the civilians and place all ninja on standby and then the abrupt attack of Kyuubi. From what we have discovered, you were well prepared for that attack. We'd like an explanation." Minato leaned back in his chair after looking up. He observed everything with half-lidded blue eyes, displaying the same casualness that Naruto so skillfully employed. "There was a threat approaching Konoha, as you well know," he said, his voice a little drawly. At his father's actions, Naruto furrowed his brow. He was projecting an air of superiority, as if to remind the council that they were only his advisors and that he was the Hokage. Although he thought such behavior was strange, he did not question it. Minato was not a fool. He knew what he was doing. Danzo, who was always prepared to question Minato's behavior, inquired, "And how did you know of the threat? How did you know that the Kyuubi would attack?" "Our scouts had spotted it heading towards our village. That day, however, it was summoned directly to Konoha proper." Everyone's breath came in sharp intakes. The idea of having a Biju summoned to Konoha appeared to frighten even Danzo. After the announcement, Kaharu was the first to speak, asking the Hokage, "What happened?" with her sharp eyes. When the dam suddenly burst, everyone began to inquire. Minato was annoyed by their loud voices, which reverberated throughout the room. It was only Danzo, Uchiha, and Nara who remained silent. The others were shook, incredulous, and demanding explanations. Minato squinted and then raised his hands in a single, loud, sharp clap. Everyone fell silent at once. The Hokage made an ambiguous gesture, which Naruto recognized right away. He moved forward without a word, exposing himself to everyone. Before he stood by his father, staring at them with his calculating blue eyes, he watched as they followed his progress with puzzled eyes. The council's most astute members were observing him and Yondaime, recognizing the similarity but not comprehending it. Others simply didn't know who he was, so they were perplexed. "This is my younger brother, Namikaze Naruto," Minato said, pointing to him. Naruto grimaced a little as his father hissed in annoyance as the room exploded in chaos once more. Hyuga Heishi yelled, "Let us not forget ourselves and start acting like 5-year-old children." His deep voice easily drowned out the commotion and silenced everyone. Minato gave the Hyuga a grateful nod before turning his icy blue eyes to everyone in front of him. "Yes. He is my younger brother. Jiraiya. Sensei accidentally stumbled upon him during his travels. He had been attacked by rogue Iwa.Nin because they found out that he was related to me." They all looked at Naruto, but he just arched his brow, unconcerned. It was obvious that they were all dubious of the tenuous explanation. "Is there a specific reason why you didn't tell us that you had a brother?" Heishi asked courteously, and Minato nodded in agreement. "Hokage. Sama, if I may ask a question?" Minato leaned back in his chair and narrowed his eyes. "You weren't informed because I, myself, didn't know that I had a brother. Nor did he said, pointing to Naruaki. "The resemblance between the two of you is quite telling, Hokage. Sama, but if you didn't know that he existed, how did Stone?" asked Nara Shikaku, who maintained his perceptive gaze fixed on Naruaki. With a sigh, Minato turned to face Naruaki. "My mother passed away quite some time ago. You must be aware that she was an Iwa.nin," said the younger Namikaze, with a slight frown. He responded with a few nods and said casually, "She was pregnant with me when she felt Konoha. She wished to be accepted back into Iwagakure but was soundly refused. They were aware that she was with a child. However, since the Namikaze clan doesn't have a bloodline, they didn't consider her important. We settled in a small town in Sha no Kuni, and that is where I stayed for a while. When I was 6, a seal master who had no apprentice to pass his skills onto, chose me, and I left my mother's home to travel with him. She never told me who my father was, and I had never seen Yondaime Sama personally to make any connections between our looks." Amused by the suspicious glances he was receiving and the calculating gaze of some, he cocked his head to the side. "The robed ninja that attacked me didn't seem as though they were searching for me. I'm assuming that they were looking to steal my supplies." He smirked inwardly at his own acting prowess and murmured thoughtfully, "They stumbled upon me just as Jiraiya Sama did." He gave his dad a chuckle. "Whether they really felt that I'm Yondaime Sama's brother or not, I'm uncertain. They seemed to be troubled by my resemblance to him. They chose to attack him, either way." He sighed. "Whilst I would consider myself a fairly skilled Fuinjutsu master, I'm not so competent when it comes to other skills." Minato was the next to laugh. "My dear son," he thought to himself, "you are a liar of the highest order." Although the majority of the council appeared to believe that assertion, Uchiha, Hyuga, and Nara appeared to have some doubts. They knew, Minato supposed, that Fuinjutsu experts could be devastating if they so desired. After all, seals could serve a variety of functions. Jiraiya Sama assisted me. He knew who I was when I told him my name, since I was using my mother's family name at the time. He brought me here so I could be treated and meet my brother. I asked Yondaime Sama if I was allowed to use our father's family name, and he agreed, so I am Namikaze Naruaki." "That's all well and good," Danzo said bluntly. "However, you seem to be forgetting the matter at hand, Yondaime Sama. What happened to the Kyuubi?" Everyone's focus shifted from Naruaki to Minato, and they all appeared intrigued once more. Grimacing, the Hokage said, "The challenging aspect of their cover was this." Ignoring the angry looks he received from his council, he said grimly, "I knew that Kyuubi was coming this way days before it actually did. I was looking for a solution to safely defeat it before it could come close to our borders. For a while, I had to ignore Naruaki's arrival. However, when Kyuubi started getting too close for comfort, I decided to act. While I was hunting for a solution, Naruaki came to visit me and caught sight of the seals I was studying. As a seal master, he is quite competent, and there are a few seals that he knows that I'm not aware of." Their gaze shifted to Naruaki, who appeared doubtful. "I decided to help. We had planned to meet the Kyuubi before it could come too close to the borders. I was trying to decide upon the safest sealing method possible. Both of us wished to avoid the prospect of a Jinchuriki." At that direct admission, Yondaime found it difficult to maintain a neutral expression. It never occurred to him that Naruaki would say it out loud. "There was no need for that," Danzo responded. "The only village that lacks a Jinchuriki is Konoha. You should have taken this opportunity to secure a Jinchuriki for us, Minato. That would have been a powerful weapon in our arsenal." Numerous council members were staring at Danzo as if he had gone insane. "The risks involved in that far outweigh the benefits, Danzo. I have no desire to commit the same inhumane mistakes that other villages have," Minato said, giving Danzo an icy look. Naruaki frowned and said, "I agree with Yondaime Sama." He stoically looked into Danzo's eyes and raised an eyebrow in flagrant defiance of his political acumen. Unfortunately, Kyuubi seemed to have been summoned directly to the village. Whatever precautions we had hoped to take couldn't be implemented in such a short time. According to reports, Uchiha Fugaku said, there were virtually no civilian casualties and very few ninja casualties. You did well, Hokage Sama, considering the situation. Yondaime accepted the compliment with a nod of his head. "You had Namikaze.san seal it away?" inquired Hyuga Heishi. "I'm assuming that the Biju was sealed away." Yondaime replied, "We wouldn't have been able to stand up against it despite the strength of our numbers." Naruaki performed a high-risk seal to seal it away. "And which seal was that?" Danzo asked, looking at Naruaki with interest. With a sideways head tilt, the young Namikaze responded in a flat voice that seemed to belittle Danzo's intelligence. "The soul seal. I won't bore you with the details. Suffice to say, it worked, since we are not minced meat." Minato's eyes narrowed as he chastised his son. He was baffled by his son's subtle attempts to agitate Danzo. As Naruaki says, the soul seal worked, but it was very risky to attempt it. Had it failed, its consequences for Naruaki would have been devastating. Had he failed, I would have performed a seal to imprison Kyuubi, but I didn't wish to take that chance. I didn't wish for it to come back for revenge. He exhaled. As it is, Naruaki's chakra had been severely depleted and he slipped into a coma for a week because of it. He stared intently at Danzo. "That's the reason why, Danzo-san. I delayed explaining my actions to you since I couldn't possibly explain it properly without his assistance." Everyone fell silent as they considered the facts. He went on when no questions were raised. "The details about the seal and a formal report of the situation will be given to you when I have time to write it," he said simply. "However, there is another matter that I wish to discuss with you." Knowing that his son's accessing eyes were on him, Minato turned to face Heishi. "Hyuga-san, could you indulge me and tell me what the purpose of the council is?" Heishi raised his eyebrows before responding. "It acts as an advisory body to the Hokage. The Kage must discuss important matters with a full general council before he can act. In the times of war, the council has no power at all, but during times of peace, the council can act as a check on the actions of the Hokage to ensure that his actions do not cause harm to Konoha and its people." With a sharp smirk that made everyone in the room tense, Minato nodded and said, "Thank you very much, Hyuga-san. Another question, if you please," he asked Hiyashi, who nodded in response. "What is the purpose of the personal council?" he asked, gesturing to Kaharu, Homura, and Danzo. They clenched, clearly anxious. Looking at them, Hiyashi's eyes narrowed as he considered whether they had done something to annoy the Hokage. Their role is to act as the representatives of the full council, since the council cannot be called to meet on every matter that arises. They are to advise the Hokage and check his actions. All three of them together can also overrule the Hokage's vote on matters if they feel that he isn't acting in the benefit of the village. They also form the leaders of the general council. After giving another nod, Minato turned to face Uchiha Fugaku. "Uchiha-san, a question for you, if you please," Minato asked, and Fugaku nodded, appearing to be quite perplexed. "Do you feel that the civilians are well represented in the council?" After glancing around the room, the Uchiha said, "I cannot honestly say that, Hokage-sama. There are no civilians here." He nodded. "And, according to the helpful facts stated by Hyuga-san, can you tell me what checks the power of the Hokage's personal advisors?" Fugaku scowled as he reviewed all of his knowledge of it. The Hokage can check their actions if they act individually, but when together, they can only be checked by the full council. However, considering the influence over the council. With a sharp smile, Minato showed that he was beginning to like Fugaku. Precisely. Sandame's hard eyes narrowed at Minato, asking, "What are you up to, Minato?" Minato was clearly trying to cause trouble. It might cause disturbances and disturb the council's tranquility. Although he was never one to be disrespectful, Minato's cold eyes met his predecessors. To the surprise of those in attendance, he said bluntly, changing some things, "Sandame-sama." To distribute the files he had prepared, Yondaime motioned to his secretary. "With Daimyo-sama's permission, I have decided to dissolve the personal advisory body. Danzo, Kaharu and Homura are no longer my personal advisors." "You have no authority to do this," Danzo hissed, and the three turned purple with rage. "You need our approval for this." The Hokage said smoothly, silencing everyone. "Let me correct you," Minato said, her eyes narrowed. "I need the approval of the entire council, not just yours. What I am going to propose is a better solution and doesn't allow for concentration of power or corruption." "I see your point, Hokage-sama. In fact, this is quite ingenious," everyone said, turning to Nara Shikaku, who was reading the file with interest. They all went to the files and began to read. When Danzo, Kaharu, and Homura realized what it meant, they went pale. The new law was certain to be approved by the council. It was equitable and gave everyone the opportunity to hold a position of authority alternately. It also served as an effective restraint on the Hokage's authority. "I must agree with Nara-san," Heishi said reflectively. "I don't see any problems with this." For almost 40 minutes, Minato sat in silence while they read and thought about his suggestion. He grinned upon realizing that everyone had completed reading. He received nods of agreement and fought the urge to smile triumphantly as he asked, "Shall we put this to vote then?" He didn't want to give the 3 people who would be most negatively impacted by the change enough time to rally council support. All those who agree, please raise their hands. Sandame's hand was among the many raised. The elderly Hokage was grinning proudly at Minato. Minato indulged them despite the obvious majority, saying, "Those who disagree, please raise your hands." If he hadn't been in front of his council, Minato would have laughed. Out of the roughly 20 hands that cast ballots, they were only 6. "Then I shall consider this motion passed." Minato laughed. "You have a week to select a representative amongst yourselves. Please choose a person you think would be the most appropriate." He took everyone's gaze. "The generals of the Oinen and ANBU forces will be informed soon, and I'll select a civilian representative within a week as well." He glanced at Fugaku. "I have selected Uchiha Fugaku-san to be one of the 2 representatives of the council in the new advisory body." He laughed at Fugaku's disbelief. "That is, of course, if you don't mind, Uchiha-san." After rapidly gathering his thoughts, Fugaku bowed formally and said, "It would be an honor, Yandaime-sama." Nodded. "Good. 3 members of the advisory body have been selected and 2 more are left. We will reconvene in a week and finalize everything. If you have any questions, please ask. We need to." When the elder Namikaze began answering the council members' questions, Naruto, who quickly disappeared into the shadows once everyone was preoccupied, grinned. Yandaime was very clever. Danzo had no room to move because of the way he rushed things along and deceived everyone with the lure of power. He was aware that Danzo and the other 2 would attempt to convince the council members to reject Minato's proposal if he allowed them to consider it for a long time. When the Hokage made a proposal this significant, he typically gave the council a week or so to make a decision. As Naruto's gaze fell on the enraged Danzo, he thought, "Good work, Yandaime-sama. He won't take this lying down." However, for the time being, Naruto grinned sharply. "Danzo. 0, Namikaze. 1. With Itachi out training somewhere and Sasuke sleeping in his crib, the house was quiet. After hearing her husband's news, Mikoto sat in front of Fugaku, stunned. She sat back and watched him, asking quietly, "What does this mean, Fugaku?" Fugaku took a sip of her tea with a, "Honestly, I don't know." He raised his eyebrows. "It sounds like it's a powerful position to be in, Mikoto. He selected me to be one of his personal advisors." The Uchiha glanced at her and narrowed his eyes, thinking. After the council was dismissed, Yandaime requested to have a private meeting with me. He said that he selected me because I was a good choice. As the head of the police department, I know what goes on within the village better than most. He also said that since I rarely have to go out of the village on missions, I'd be easily accessible to him when he needs me. Mikoto replied, "It does make sense. However, why didn't he select the Hyuga?" Yandaime says that the very purpose of the new system was to avoid concentration of power in the hands of a few. He feels that Hyuga is already very influential in the council and selecting him wouldn't be a wise move. He selected me because he thinks that I'm just as capable as Hyuga, if not less likely to let that power get to my head, Fugaku said, sneering at the mention of his rival before glancing down at the refreshing cup of tea in front of him. He actually said that. Mikoto smiled. Fugaku smirked and said, "We all know that Yandaime-sama can be a bit too casual sometimes, but," he frowned and said, "I understand what he's trying to do." He looked at his wife thoughtfully and crossed his fingers in front of his mouth. "Somehow I get the feeling that there is more at play here, Mikoto. Something to do with that swine, Danzo." He frowned and said, "The way that man was bristling when the motion was passed was a bit alarming, I must say." Mikoto was staring at him with worry. "You don't think that he's planning something, do you? You know that he didn't support Sandame nor does he support Yandaime. He won't be planning a coup, would he?" Fugaku sighed. "I don't know. I've told some of our spies to keep an eye on him. However, I know that Yandaime-sama is ready for him. I think this whole motion was passed to take power away from the 3 advisors." Nodding, Mikoto said, "It seems so." After a lengthy period of silence, Fugaku stopped drinking his tea and said, "Another interesting thing happened. Yandaime just introduced us to his brother. Quite an odd coincidence, don't you think? For him to appear now, out of the blue?" he said. Mikoto flinched when the unsettling man was mentioned, whispering, "I have met him." She looked at Fugaku and said, "There's something about him." When Fugaku raised an eyebrow in response to his query, his wife sighed and shook her head, indicating her confusion with a wave of her hand. They barely exchanged a few words, but Itachi seemed to connect instantly with him on some level, she said. The Uchiha clan head frowned. He wants Itachi to be his apprentice. He murmured hesitantly, I think it would be a good idea to let them be, Makoto. We have no idea how powerful Namikaze Naruaki is, but I know that there is more to him than he lets on. In the meeting, he made this little comment, you know. He looked at her, his eyes shrewd and calculating. He said that he was fairly skilled in Fuin Jutsu but not so much in other skills, but I doubt him. Yandaime. Sama got this amused look on his face when his brother said that. Moreover, Yandaime. Sama also said that his brother knew some seals that he didn't know, and we know that Yandaime. Sama is very skilled in Fuin Jutsu. If he's better than Yandaime Sama in sealing, then he's very powerful. But do you trust him? Makoto cautiously inquired. As he reflected on the meeting and the man they were talking about, Fugaku snorted, hardly. I'd be a fool to do so, but he is Yandaime's brother and we know that he saved Konoha, putting his own life at risk. He appeared thoughtful, saying, there's something about him. He moves like seasoned ANBU do, Makoto. He has taken interest in our boy. What reason could he have? She asked, shifting and frowning as she peered out of the open shoji doors. Fugaku sighed, I told you he wants Itachi to be his apprentice. He sighed, I don't mind if he does. Itachi will flourish under him, I can tell. Our boy is brilliant and it takes someone brilliant to learn Fuin Jutsu. That would explain why Namikaze took an interest in Itachi. Possibly, he spotted the potential and wanted to utilize it. But, Makoto, think about this. He continued, this could mean so much for the Uchiha clan. The Namikaze clan may be small but it is very powerful now. Yandaime. Sama is the Hokage and now this brother of his, who seems equally brilliant. He reached for her hand. And you know that Namikaze Naruto, growing up with such intelligent and powerful people, would be a prodigy as well. It's likely that he may not be naturally gifted as Itachi or Yandaime Sama is, but you know that his upbringing will make him a force to reckon with. He gazed at her eyes. A bond between master and apprentice is a deep bond. If Sasuke and Naruto grow up to be friends, and that seems very likely, then our clan will have more influence and power than the Hyuga. Makoto breathed deeply, you're right of course. She agreed, presently, our chances of establishing a close friendship with Yandaime Sama's family do seem extremely high. Yandaime Sama entrusting me with the care of his son while he's at work is an honor as well. She grinned softly, things finally seem to be turning our way, Fugaku. Fugaku gave a nod, yes, it does seem as though the Uchiha clan is finally getting the respect and acknowledgement it deserves. The experienced gaze scanned the area with keen blue eyes, examining every detail that might support or undermine his mission. He looked around the outside of the compound he was going to enter and gave himself a firm nod. A few cage bunshin appeared after he executed a single seal. He gave his replicas a silent nod, then watched as Henge transformed the clones into rats and they fled. Waiting for the clones to dispel themselves was all that was left to do. With all his senses open to take in his surroundings, he relaxed and closed his eyes, leaning against the tree he was hiding behind. Fortunately, the mission was not time-bound, and it took the clones a long time to explore the entire compound. He occupied himself by verifying the seals he had sketched on plain paper tags. He had devised a method that made him known as an assassin who never left blood in his wake. Clean, quick, and silent. Naruaki wanted all his missions to be like that. As the clones dispelled themselves, he felt a faint twinge of pain in his temple and carefully considered the information that was presented to him. A small group of 5 Kurigakers ninja had been hired by the targets to protect a sizable manor. However, the manor was guarded by a large number of street brawlers and thugs in addition to the team. With a gentle sneer, he squinted his eyes as a mental map of the grounds took shape. He targeted 5 businessmen, who were causing problems for the local merchants and farmers in the small villages close to Hai no Kuni's eastern border. Naruaki was well aware that his father wanted to test his strength, even though this wasn't exactly a task assigned to an ANBU-level ninja. The mission was a test. Naruaki was aware of that. To test his skills, Yandaime had sent him on an A-class assassination mission. He had a faint feeling that an ANBU from Konoha, likely a captain, was following him around. With a slight smirk, he quickly tied his hair and covered the glowing, conspicuous locks with a black bandana. Before he moved, his eyes looked around once more. With the information his cage bunshin had given him still fresh in his mind, he crept into the compound. With a calculating gleam in his eyes, he fingered the paper tags in his pouch and found the best and fastest way into the manor. Control the seals. He decided to stick to Fuin, Tai, and Kenjutsu after stroking the hilt of his sword. He had been affected in some way by the removal of Kyuubi and the lack of the seal. Despite not knowing what it was, he sensed a change in his body. He was aware of his limitations and did not dare try to use high-level ninjutsu. He suddenly froze, his blue eyes darting to a dark corner. When he noticed a Kirigakure nin slouching comfortably against the wall, he arched an eyebrow. The boy was yawning and scratching his head, as if he was extremely bored. Naruaki suspected that the ninja was at Chunin level based on the boy's youth and the strength he could sense in him. He didn't appear to have the experience and vigilance that most Chunin were supposed to have. Naruaki actually thought he was a newly promoted Chunin. Pulling one of the numerous control seals from his utility pouch, Naruaki thought to himself, "Tisk. Incompetent." He moved quickly and silently, taking the ninja by surprise and pressing the paper tag against the boy's neck. As he held the struggling child in his arms, he smiled calmly and said, "Why hello, my good fellow. Sorry for the inconvenience, but you're going to be my servant now." He pressed a glowing finger against the paper tag seal and said, "Activate." In Naruaki's arms, his captive went limp and froze. His eyes briefly went glassy before becoming clear again. "You never saw me here. You'll guard Kanazawa Satsuma's room while I'm inside and assure anyone who passes you that he's fine. If they ask whether you have spotted any intruders, you'll say you haven't and do your best to stop them from knowing my presence." After the boy nodded, Naruaki patted his head and muttered, "Good boy." He then disappeared, making his way to the room of his first target. Before focusing his senses, he glanced around to make sure the target was the only person in the room. When he discovered no one, he moved with ease into the room, his narrowed eyes searching the darkness for his target. It was clear that Satsuma was asleep. A dagger was spread out on the desk next to the big, plush bed. Gazing at the man dozing in the middle of the bed, he raised an eyebrow. It was obvious that Naruaki would finish the man before he could get the dagger, even if he were awake. He reached into his pouch and took out another paper tag. This one was lethal. He held the tag between two fingers and looked at the seal with a professional eye, looking for any defects. He approached the sleeping body on the bed slowly and carefully positioned the tag on the target's bare chest. The gentle touch on his chest caused the man to twitch, but he kept snoring. Instant death is the sealing technique in Fuin Jutsu, Sokushi. The blue eyes shone. Activate. After that, the body in front of him made no sound at all. Before life left that stare, he saw the target's eyes open and his lips part in a silent scream. All of this took place in a few seconds. The paper dot tag was now blank, but slim fingers took it and put it back in his pocket. Anyone looking at the body would assume that the man died of a straightforward heart attack because the skin the seal had touched was unmarked. That is, if they were foolish enough to overlook the fact that his head is also missing. He pulled one of his two swords from its sheath. It was his daisho's second sword, a short wakizashi. After completing his task, he sealed the dead body's neck to prevent any blood from spilling. Naruaki did not want to draw attention to himself because ninjas were sensitive to the smell of blood. As instructed, he quickly decapitated the target with his wakizashi and sealed his head in a sealing scroll. Kanazawa Hiroshi is next on the list. He noticed that the ninja he was controlling was now accompanied by 4 thugs who were loudly chatting as he crept from the room. Naruaki furrowed his brow at their folly. He could easily slip past them with the noise they were making. His plans were somewhat derailed, though, when another Kirigakure ninja showed up, glaring at the thugs with narrowed eyes. The man's every move was dictated by experience and authority. Naruaki could tell that this newcomer was a superior ninja based on the way he appeared to assess the thugs and engage with the chunin he was controlling. Probably a junin. The boy's vest concealed the portion of his neck, but luckily Naruaki had applied the control seal there. The older Kiri.nin, on the other hand, would become suspicious if he noticed a change in the child's behavior and knew his companion well. Naruaki squinted. Although he had complete control over his captive, the control seal was still among his least effective tools. He was relieved when the older man merely gave the boy a nod, chastised the thugs, and turned to leave. But as the Kiri.nin left, Naruaki noticed a slight but noticeable shift in his demeanor. He grinned. This one is capable. His eyes narrowed to watch the man's movements as he followed him stealthily. With his blue eyes shining triumphantly, he pressed the 5 glowing kanji that had formed at the tips of his fingers against the wall, trapping both himself and his opponent behind an impenetrable barrier. Unless someone happened upon them, no one would be aware of their confrontation because neither sound nor chakra could pass through the barrier. Shinobi.san. He blasted. As soon as Naruaki finished speaking, there was the sharp sound of metal on metal. I happen to like smart people, the Yondaime's son muttered. The Kiri.nin calmly asked, Who are you? As if oblivious to the younger boy's calculating light and the sheer force of Naruaki's blow. With his eyebrows up, Naruaki said, Me? You honestly expect me to tell you my name? he asked sardonically before he moved his arm and watched the ninja fly back with a simple twist of his wrist. Well, sir, you were at least able to sense my presence, weren't you? Is that the limit of your strength? While his opponent calmly evaluated him and looked for his weaknesses, Naruaki was already in motion. Oomph. The older man gritted his teeth as Naruaki's blow rattled his arm, and the former ANBU grinned. Naruaki had a seal applied to the man's forehead in a flash. Before his hands formed seals, he waved and flipped away from the enemy, saying, I don't have time to waste with you, so bye. Fuin Jutsu. Goka. Kashu. Sealing technique. Hellfire. Burn. The Kiri.nin screamed and collapsed to his knees, convulsing on the ground with his hands grabbing at his forehead. As he struggled to cope with the phantom pain, he lay on the floor, thrashing and turning, letting out low moans and sobs. He eventually went limp after losing the fight. When the older man lost consciousness, Naruaki scowled and moved forward, saying, I won't kill you. He reached down and removed the seal from the man's forehead, but once more there were no signs of it. I don't want to risk retribution from your village, he said. His glowing fingertips changed the barrier, making it smaller as he stood up and touched the wall once more. He left the now invisible shinobi behind and walked away calmly. He had made numerous fire seals, including the Guka seal. The first of Guka's 3 levels was called Kashu. An individual would be rendered unconscious for almost 4 days due to the severity of the seal's burn. He'd erected a barrier around the Kiri.nin that would hold for 1. Death was guaranteed in the final 2 levels. Level 2, Demono or Boil, performed exactly as the name implied. The seal was lethal because it raised the blood's temperature so much. A person would be killed by his own blood. The final level, Kantsu, pierced the body with fire arrows, striking and killing the majority of the target's vital organs. With a single step, he disappeared from view after shaking his head. He had 4 more to murder. When Naruaki noticed a Kiri.nin and 3 additional guards at the door of Kanazawa Hiroshi's room, he arched an eyebrow. He sighed inaudibly and produced 4 Kage Bunshin. Killing some thugs who have been terrorizing innocent farmers and merchants will have no repercussions, but killing a Kurigakure ninja will. Before the ninja could respond, a clone pressed the control seal against him. While he crept into the room, the real Naruaki let his clones handle the trivial tasks. Before he shut the door, he had 3 guards dead and 1 more ninja under the control seal. He approached his sleeping target with a disinterested look at the door, but he sighed when he saw a woman dozing next to him. His hands began to form seals as he approached the sleeping couple. He smirked, slipped his hand into his pouch, and placed the tag on the target's chest. Go to sleep, dear lady. He whispered, pressing a glowing hand against her forehead. And don't awake for a long while. As another of his targets perished, he muttered, activate. You think you're very smart, don't you, Konoha scum? A low voice growled against his ear, and Naruaki raised a brow, seemingly unfazed. Suddenly, he felt the bite of cold steel against his sensitive throat. You killed 2 of our clients already, I'm not gonna let you kill the other 3. Oh? He inquired, turning his blue eyes to look at the Kurigakure ninja who believed he had him imprisoned. What are you going to do? He asked. As the kunai at his throat moved, Naruaki grinned and said, isn't it obvious? I'm gonna kill you. His opponent was taken aback by the sound of metal hitting metal, and his eyes widened when he noticed a long, shining silver blade slicing through his kunai like a knife through butter. The ninja leapt back, dropped the kunai, and unwrapped a dagger that looked menacing. Naruaki hummed and then moved slightly, observing his opponent's stance while holding his sword delicately in one hand. Before the man passed away, he had engaged in numerous sparring matches with Sarutobi Isuma, who was a skilled dagger user. Naruaki slipped into a stance and said, tell me, did you tell anyone of my presence? The older man grinned and said, but they were just brats and I'm an experienced Junin. There is no way you can escape me, bastard. Just because no one knows of your presence doesn't mean that you can escape this place out. The Kiri.nin frowned at him and said, the 2 Chunin I encountered seemed to be, as he pointedly glanced at the Konoha ninja. Compromise. The Junin choked, his eyes widening as Naruaki's sword pierced his shoulder. The Kiri.nin screamed, curse you, and then lunged at Naruaki with his dagger. The son of the Hokage narrowed his eyes and watched the charging man. The boy stepped forward, tilted his head to the side, and disappeared. The opponent's entire arm trembled as a loud clang singled the point where 2 blades met. Terrified to see that he had no sight of his enemy's movements, he swallowed his angry curses. He gasped as he was pushed back with another clang, clutching one arm while glaring into his opponent's cold blue eyes. He hissed, you bastard. Naruaki sneered and easily sidestepped his dagger's thrust. The room echoed with the sharp sound of metal on metal, and Naruaki was relentless. The enemy ninja winced as his opponent's blade pulled blood from his chest, and he grunted as he avoided another blow. He glared at his opponent while gritting his teeth. So powerful. How in the hell are his blows so powerful? Only a few minutes into the battle, the Junin was heavily painting, his palm bleeding and red as he struggled to keep his dagger in place to protect himself from Naruaki's sword's wrath. As he struggled to control his body's shaking, he scurried backwards, desperately parrying another thrust and moistening his suddenly dry lips. Now that he was facing the force of every blow, his opponent's sword appeared more like a lethal weapon than a fancy toy. The Konoha ninja approached him with a composed demeanor, not even perspiring. When he heard the long, shining blade slicing through the air, the Kirigakure ninja made a feeble attempt to block. The man stepped back to escape death, and the dagger dropped from numb, bleeding fingers. Naruaki glanced down at the fallen dagger before turning back to face his opponent, who was slowly forming hand seals with his fingers. Before his opponent could react, the Konoha nin shook his head and reached forward, grabbing a wrist. Naruaki let the broken arm fall and snapped the Junin's bone, causing a cry to reverberate throughout the room. Before reaching into his pouch to retrieve another seal, he said, "No ninjutsu." He smiled and said, "We don't want the others to know of my presence, now do we?" Before applying a seal to the man's forehead, saying, "Fuin jutsu. Surikesu. Sealing technique. Erase." The enemy shinobi went unconscious as his eyes glazed over. After retrieving the target's head, Naruaki left the room with greater caution. It was quite possible that someone had heard the altercation and was warning the others. He had to complete his mission as soon as possible before they called in a backup team in order to avoid conflict. He placed the control seals on the Kiri ninja and absently checked his connections. Startled to discover that they were still active on them, stifling the two enemy ninjas' free will, he raised an eyebrow. The seals must not have been found by the Junin. As he crept into his third target's room, Naruaki thought, "Good. The less they know, the more advantageous it is for me," he said. "They don't know how to combat someone who can use offensive seals in active battle because true Fuin Jutsu masters are uncommon. Other villages don't need to know about my sealing abilities." He frowned as he looked at the empty room before turning to the terrace where his target was standing by the railing and sipping a drink. Sake, no doubt. Naruaki thought as he slipped into a shadowed, dark room. It was a waste to use the Surikesu seal on that man if he was unaware of its existence. All I could do was wipe out the memory of his experience with the controlled Chunin. They will still be aware of my Kenjutsu skills. He scowled at the man's short kodachi as he studied the target. Naruaki gave up on using the instant death seal and thought, "This one is a cautious bastard." He patiently waited for several minutes. Naruaki moved as soon as the target returned to the room. The man discovered a sword piercing his chest before he could even comprehend what was happening. With his katana in one hand, Naruaki quickly decapitated the victim with his wakizashi, grimacing at the blood that was now all over the bed and the plush carpet. As he sealed another head into his scroll, he thought to himself, "Messy, messy." He accessed the situation in his mind as he slipped from the room. In addition to a variety of thugs and would-be samurai, he was aware that the compound was home to 5 ninja. Only one ninja was free to cause trouble, and the other 4 were out of the way. "I'd better get this done quickly." He had been silent, but he killed the next 2 targets as quickly as he could, not giving much thought to the noise or the smell of blood. Although he had not yet faced the lone absent foe, he had a feeling the ninja was not within the manor. In one of the many hallways he had come across, he knelt down and quickly drew a seal on the floor while frowning. When he was finished, he narrowed his eyes and watched the whole set of runes glow dimly. After finishing, he placed the 5 unconscious individuals by the compound's gates and removed the 4 ninja and the woman he had put to sleep from the manor. The 2 shinobi in captivity had no recollection of him since he had already turned off the control seals. With a sigh, Naruaki leapt over the compound's perimeter wall and left the area. It was so pathetically low security. An ANBU was never going to carry out the mission. He didn't think so, anyway. Or perhaps he misperceived. Since joining the force and being commanded by Danzo, he had never really carried out a typical ANBU mission. The route commander probably only sent him on high-risk missions because he was Danzo's pet Jinchuriki. That or Yondaime didn't think a boy of 18 was strong enough to be a general, much less an ANBU captain, so he was attempting to send Naruaki on safe missions. He wasn't blamed by Naruaki. The Yondaime had every reason to doubt him, and the circumstances surrounding his promotion were undoubtedly dubious. He chose to think about it when he wasn't on a mission and shook his head. He glanced over his shoulder as he got some distance away from the manor and grinned sharply and slightly sinisterly. "Boom," he whispered, and the manor burst into flames. Now dead were the self-proclaimed samurai and thugs inside the building. Now that he was satisfied with the mission, the former ANBU ran for Konoha. He saw something as he was traveling to Konoha. Smiling slightly, he reached into his kunai pouch and threw a set of shuriken in one direction. Seeing 3 enraged Kirigakure ninja emerge from the shadows, Naruaki said bluntly, "You might as well wave your hands about and scream, 'I'm here, I'm here,' with the level of noise you are making." Assuming that the youngest and weakest of them all was the missing ninja he had previously sensed, Naruaki hummed reflectively, "Ah." He tilted his head to the side and said, "You brought back, up, huh?" He looked at the more powerful opponents and said, "I doubt you're coming here all the way from Kiri. 7 shinobi were assigned to protect the criminals. Some of you actually look competent." He raised his eyebrows and said, "Quite a number to be granted for the protection of a few measly drug lords." He smiled when the ninja hardened and the youngest of them appeared perplexed. "Ah." With a wise nod, he said, "Are you spying on Konoha? Using the drug lords and their power to see what we're up to?" Naruaki drew his sword and smirked, saying, "Ingenious. You would have gotten away with it too. Unfortunately for you," he said, smiling sharply and moving, "it didn't work out." "Ninpo. Kirigakure no jutsu," snarled one of the more experienced shinobi, his hands forming swift seals. Angrily, Naruaki scowled. In the absence of his Kyuubi enhanced senses, this was a problematic jutsu. As he broadened his senses, Naruaki thought, "This will be a test to see how much I've truly lost when Kyuubi was taken away." Abruptly, he lifted his sword to deflect a kunai's incoming blow. "They were too noisy to use the silent killing technique effectively," he said, raising a brow. Recalling both Zabuza and Kisame, he whispered, "This jutsu works well when you have large swords to assist you." He pushed the man away. He brought his katana up to block a kunai from another adversary while dodging another blow from his opponent. As his sword cut through the mist, he thought, "They're giving themselves away." The most careless of the 3 sneered at Naruaki, saying, "Give up, Konoha scum. You may be smart but you're nothing against 3 of us." The inexperienced boy's position was obvious. He turned on his heel and made a clean stab. He knew he had pierced the boy's lung, just missing his heart, because of the wet gurgle. "We'll kill you before you can go and report this to your Yandaime Hokage," erupted one of them, breaking the stillness of the clearing. Naruaki ducked another blade, his eyes shining calculatingly as he assessed the situation. Something wasn't quite right here. These ninja weren't good fighters, but they were spies. It was clear that Kiri had planned to send observant ninja. Perhaps they didn't think that skill and power were essential for a purely espionage mission. How stupid of them. The whole thing was becoming rather absurd to the former ANBU. Were his opponents aware of Zabuza's skillful use of the silent killing technique? As they plotted their attack, he could hear their breaths, see how their movements warped the surrounding fog, and hear their whispers. Not that they were making an effort. Sheathing his sword, Naruaki stood up straight and gazed calmly at the surrounding fog. "Your actions are futile." He drew blood from his own palm to use as ink, ignoring their irate cries. He made a very precise and complex movement with his blood-stained finger, channeling his chakra to create a seal in the air before him. He continued to move while avoiding the enemy ninja's attacks. After finishing, he turned around and faced him, allowing his chakra to burst through the seal. Special seal. Genshuku. Gravity, in particular. The impact was immediate. The fog vanished in an instant, and he saw the 2 shinobi that were left fall hard to the ground. They were stuck in that position, only able to twitch and try to move, as an enormous force seemed to keep them in place. The blood loss had already rendered the careless one unconscious. Gazing down at the glowing seal that had developed in front of his palm, he moved forward while carefully focusing on the seal. "Now, don't be worried. Our interrogation expert is a pretty decent guy." He laughed sheepishly. He dropped to his knees, slammed the glowing seal to the floor, and then pushed his hand away. When they attempted to move, he raised an eyebrow and looked at them coolly, assuming the technique had been turned off. "I've merely anchored the seal down into the ground so that I can have my hands free." He quickly lowered his hand and said, "Good night. Tie them up and let's return to Konoha. Each carries one and make sure that they do not awake until we reach Konoha." The clones nodded, and Naruaki turned toward Konoha and drove away after disabling the gravity seal and creating 3 cage bunshin. Yandaime whispered, "You're back," as his ANBU entered the office. His curiosity about Naruaki's performance during the mission was strong. When Yandaime motioned for the ANBU to remove his mask and put it away, he nodded and sat down. He scowled at the masked ninja in front of him and said, "Remove your mask and give me your report, Narashikado. Feel free to voice your personal opinion on this." Yandaime raised an eyebrow and said, "Well?" Nara remained quiet for a while, as if he was collecting his thoughts. Yandaime. Sama, you had asked me to evaluate his abilities on this mission, but, he paused. I have to admit that it is difficult to do so. He then scowled as he looked up at his leader. The Hokage furrowed his brow in confusion. I've never encountered a person who fights like he does, sir. I believe that if we need to know of his full combat abilities, we need to have him battling a ninja of at least ANBU captain level. He took a moment to think. I don't want to know his full combat abilities, I just want to know if he's skilled enough to be in our ANBU. Yandaime acknowledged, I need to know his placement. Well, he's most certainly skilled enough to be an ANBU. Nara replied, his style of fighting is a bit unorthodox. When you informed us that he was an expert in Fuinjutsu, I didn't expect it to be like this. What do you mean? Yandaime asked, scowling in perplexity. Sir, most consider you to be an expert in Fuinjutsu as well, and I've only seen you use seals in active battle situations when you perform Hirishin no Jutsu. Nara clarified, your brother, on the other hand, seemed to rely primarily on Fuinjutsu and Kenjutsu during the mission. In fact, the only ninjutsu that I saw him use was Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Yandaime gave a contemplative hum. I'm aware that you don't know much about seals, but I'd like you to explain those seals and their effects to me. I'll try my best, sir. He murmured before responding, I wasn't close enough to thoroughly analyze the seals. I could see that he had some seals drawn on small paper. Tags. The very first seal he used was on a Kirigakure Chunin, one of the ninja from the Formation C Kirigakure team that the targets had hired. With a raised eyebrow, Yandaime questioned in mild disbelief, Formation C? As in a team with 4 Junin and 3 Chunin? To guard 5 measly drug lords? I expected some ninja protection detail, but not that much. It seems a bit excessive. Nara cracked a grin. That's exactly what your brother thought as well. He suspects that they were discreetly spying on us. He has already brought them in for interrogation. Shikado nodded his head. A risky move, but if our interrogators find something before Kirigakure contacts us, we'll escape the repercussions of it. It was a risky but necessary move. If they were indeed spying on us, we need to know why. Yandaime pondered. I'll ask him more about this tonight. You were talking about seals on paper, tags? Yes. Of the 8 types of seals he used, only 3 weren't drawn on paper. Tags, Nara said, nodding and furrowing his beard. Yandaime whispered, interesting, and motioned for Nara to go on. Yandaime raised an eyebrow in surprise, attempting to figure out how such a seal would function. The first seal that he used on the mission seemed some sort of mind control device. I cannot discern its purpose accurately, but the ninja who was under its influence seemed to follow Naruto-san's commands. The next seal that he used was frankly quite fearsome, Yandaime. Sama. He calls it Fuinjutsu. Sokushi. Sealing technique. Instant death. He simply placed the seal on the target's chest and the target died. Minato frowned and said, died? Just like that? Nodding, Nara continued, without even a single sound, sir. I suspect that the seal delivers some sort of shock to the heart and is very location specific. It seems that it must be placed very close to the heart if it is to work, but I can't be certain. Minato hummed quietly as he gestured to the proceed. The next seal that he used was a standard one that every ANBU and Hunter Nin uses. It was to prevent the blood from spilling once the target's head was taken as evidence. Yandaime muttered absently, that instant death seal intrigues me. Was it a Raiden-based seal or a pure chakra seal? His words confused Shikado. Sir? With a shake of his head, Yandaime said, never mind, please continue. The Nara gave a nod. Another seal he used is something similar to what I've seen you use. He created a barrier so that no noise or chakra leaked past it. The dome seal. Yandaime gave a nod. Quite a malleable seal, not very strong but excellent for concealing one's presence. At this, Yandaime grinned slightly, his eyes gleaming with knowledge, and Nara shook his head. Quite possible, sir. I was inside the barrier, which leads me to believe that your brother was aware of my presence and was simply indulging me. There was another seal that quite baffled me. He called this Fuinjutsu. Goka. Kashu. Sealing technique. Hellfire. Burn. This seal too was drawn on a paper dot tag. It seemed to cause the target immense pain. I can only conclude what its purpose was from its name. There was certainly no outward evidence of burning or any sort of fire. Leaning forward with curiosity, Yandaime questioned, it was internal then? Did the target die? He was eager to learn how to use the methods. He was curious as to where Naruto picked up the skills. Perhaps these interesting seals were made by his son. The extent of his son's knowledge was unknown. Nara stopped at Yandaime's apparent excitement and said, "No sir." He admitted, "I assumed that Naruto-san would prefer not to have his name on the bingo books just yet, and he didn't intend for any Kirigakure ninja to die in order to avoid political consequences." Minato gestured impatiently for Nara to continue, murmuring absently, "Definitely a fire-based seal. Maybe a barrier of water element to contain the burn within the body. How fascinating." Another seal he used was something called Fuin Jutsu. Surikesu. Sealing technique. "Erase," Shikado said after giving his leader a funny look. "Probably to get rid of something. Once more, it's best to ask him about it." "I shall," Minato scowled. "I can't help but be fascinated by his abilities. I could learn a lot about seals from him." The idea almost made him smile. The brothers seemed to have some things in common, so Nara forced herself not to laugh. Then he used a slightly more complicated version of the seal used in the explosive tags. Remembering the loud explosion that left his ears ringing, he shook his head and said, "It wasn't very discreet, I must admit. I had a chance to look at the seal before I had to leave the premises." He knew that a different ninja was bringing in reinforcements of some kind. Minato whispered, "One more seal." "Yes." Nara grinned and said, "The most intriguing for last. Genshuku is a special seal." "Death?" Yandaime raised an eyebrow in question. "As the name suggests, the seal somehow affects the force of gravity and pulls the targets down," Nara said, nodding. "Given that the opponents were immobile, I assumed that there was a lot of pressure. He was mobile when he performed this seal. When he created the seal and used it, he was fighting and avoiding the enemy ninja's attacks. He did not draw the seal on a solid surface, sir, nor did he use a paper dot tag. In the air, he drew the seal." Yandaime gave them a disbelieving glance and said, "In air? How could such a thing exist?" For once, Nara appeared disoriented as she shrugged. "Gravity. This is more than I could have ever imagined. He has not only mastered the art of layering elements within a seal, but he has also mastered the art of combining them to simulate advanced chakra nature manipulation. I've never heard of such techniques," Yandaime scowled thoughtfully. "Perhaps Jiraiya Sama could assist. And if Kushina-san," he offered. Nara hesitated, biting his tongue at the blunder. As he sat back and sighed, Yandaime smiled sadly and said, "She would have definitely offered some of her expert opinion in the matter." Head bent, Nara said, "I'm sorry, sir. He only used Fuin Jutsu," the Hokage said, shaking his head and turning to face the ANBU. "Do you have any other information for me?" "He used Fuin Jutsu to deal with the major obstacles, but from what I can see, he is also very skilled with the sword," the Nara said, shaking his head. The man appeared somewhat perplexed, saying, "A samurai weapon in the hands of the ninja, quite baffling." Yandaime heard him and grinned in amusement, saying, "He is very fast, Yandaime. Sama, almost surpassing your speed, though I believe that you defeat him in that aspect with the help of Hiraishin." Nara paused as another thought occurred to him, "That's unless, like you, he has also developed a seal to facilitate his speed." He ordered the clones to use henge and accompany him in exploring enemy territory after using Kage Bunshin as a tool to obtain a map of the manor. "What else can you tell me?" Yandaime nodded. The strategy was typically employed by the majority of Junin and ANBU to safely spy on enemies. The ninja said, "He used only what was necessary and nothing more. He was perceptive, calm, and level. Headed during the mission. No needless waste of time or chakra." He appeared impressed by that, saying, 16-year-old boys typically have a tendency to go overboard. He demonstrated patience and experience in the way he carried out the mission. Every move was planned. "Did he take any chances?" The Hokage scowled. "Make any errors?" "A few things didn't go as planned for him, but he coped," Nara said, shaking his head. "My suspicion is that he wanted to enter and exit covertly." He leaned back and looked inward, saying, "I also think he didn't intend to destroy the manor. His strategy was to use minimal force to gain maximum advantage. He concentrated on completing the mission as soon as he thought they knew he was there. Regarding taking chances, he didn't. In fact, there was no reason to." Yandaime gave a contemplative nod. With a wry smile, Nara remarked, "He seemed bored by the mission, Yandaime. Sama. He made this look pretty easy, but I suspect the Fuin Jutsu gives him an advantage. He finished the mission in an hour, and he did it well, albeit with a level of carelessness and disregard that most people would mistake for arrogance. He has such unwavering faith in his skills." Yandaime. Sama, that meticulous preparation and execution seem to suggest that he has completed much more challenging missions. "A mission that involves going up against 7 experienced ninja is hardly a simple mission, Nara-san," said Yandaime, frowning as he ran his fingers through his hair. "I believe that by giving him this, I was pushing his limits. Do I have the child underestimated again?" or were the enemy ninja weak? According to standards, Junin and new ANBU recruits are typically given such a mission. The test was suitable for someone such as Naruto-san. However, his Fuin Jutsu is a very formidable weapon in his hands. Nara paused to scratch his chin thoughtfully. I've never encountered anything like this, and I doubt that our enemies have. He is, after all, just 16. Nara scowled. We are unable to counter this fighting style, which gives Naruto-san the upper hand. You mean to imply that the mission seemed easy because of his Fuin Jutsu skills? Minato asked, leaning back and raising a brow. I understand what you mean, he said, scowling inwardly. For such missions, his Fuin Jutsu appears to be perfect. If we take away the arsenal of Fuin Jutsu that he has, I don't know where he stands in terms of strength, Nara continued, his eyes narrowing as he elaborated on his observations. His Kenjutsu skills seem formidable, though I've only caught a mere glimpse of them, he said, leaning back thoughtfully. He has great speed and strength. I would conclude that Naruto-san uses a lot of force in each of his sword strikes. Other than that, though, it's all conjecture. How well he would perform against a Kenjutsu master is unknown to me. Minato exhaled. So essentially, we garnered nothing about his skills from this mission. The Nara gave a wink, nothing except for the fact that he is definitely skilled enough to be in the ANBU. Excellent. He shook his head, saying, if I'm right, it would be best if we wait for a while. I'll talk to the general and see about recruiting him into our ANBU forces. Sama Yandaime. Looking out the window, Minato sighed and said, I think Naruto is still not well. He looked tired when he gave me the scroll with the heads of the targets. I had to let him go without requesting a complete report. Nara scowled, weary? I think he's currently funding the Kyuubi's seclusion. His body is weak, and recovering from such a drain typically takes months. Although he recovered more quickly than most, Yandaime frowned at Nara and said, well, that'll be all. I think it would be best if we don't tax him. Nara-san, thank you, you are free to depart. Just one more thing, Nara-san. Yandaime whispered, I want you to put together a basic squad of strong and reliable ANBU, ones that can stay out of Naruto's senses. Nara Shikado nodded and turned to go, but Minato stopped him. I'm too smart to undervalue Danzo and his friends. I am aware that he is still in charge of the ANBU route. He might pursue Naruto or Naruto. I want to keep them safe at all times. Although he frowned thoughtfully, Nara nodded and said, I'll get to it as soon as I can, but I'm sure Naruto-san won't appreciate this. With fierce, narrowed eyes, Minato scoffed, saying, well, I don't care what he thinks. He is now my responsibility, and I will stop at nothing to protect my family. I won't let some avaricious jerk take Naruto and Naruto away from me. Losing Kushina was enough. It was late in the evening, and Yandaime and Naruto had both fallen into a tired sleep when the rhythmic tapping of Naruto's fingers broke the stillness in the library. But he was alert, at last able to find some quiet time to think about his plans, and he was amazed at how much he had accomplished in just a few days. The cost of sealing the Kyuubi had been high. His mother had just escaped his grasp, right in front of his eyes, and he had been unable to save her. He realized that he had at least saved his father, despite the fact that his mother's passing had broken him to pieces. After all, one parent was better than none at all, and Naruto would never have to grow up without a father. Furthermore, he had quietly persuaded Yandaime to depose Danzo from his position of authority and grant Uchiha the recognition they so desperately desired. It was a positive step toward winning the Uchiha clan's allegiance, and although he wouldn't be aware of the full impact for some time, he had a sense that it would be successful. If the Uchiha continued to attempt to rebel, well, he would deal with it when it happened. Furthermore, Itachi was at last his to shape, and he would be the one to determine whether or not the Uchiha massacre occurred, holding the brilliant Uchiha in his hands. He had some experience dealing with Konohamaru and his silly group, and he needed to keep Itachi grounded whether he was a good teacher or not. It should be easy to deal with Itachi, who was clearly a bright and eager student. He saw the Uchiha massacre as one of the major turning points in Konoha's history, and he knew that it was a huge loss of power, particularly the loss of prodigies like Itachi and Sasuke. He was determined not to allow either of them to leave Konoha because Itachi was too significant and powerful to lose, and he was also a saint, and Naruto didn't want someone who had been so devoted to Konoha to simply die like that. Itachi would help a lot against Madara, Pain, and the like. Naruto was no fool. He knew that although his best friend was very powerful and skilled, he was no match for Itachi. Sasuke's Sharingan had more potential than Itachi's, but the older Uchiha was superior in both skill and mental toughness. First, he had to identify the illness that made Itachi so weak that Sasuke was able to kill him. Secondly, He needed to ensure that Itachi never achieved the Mangekyo Sharingan because Itachi's real strength lay in his innate abilities rather than in mastering his bloodline limit. He would develop that strength and make Itachi a powerful shinobi without the help of Mangekyo Sharingan. It was best to leave Sasuke alone, unless the boy decided to become envious of Itachi or do something equally stupid and fall into Orochimaru's trap once more. Sasuke had a feeling that Itachi would take care of his brother himself. If necessary, Naruto would bring Sasuke back this time, kicking and screaming. Naturally, Naruto was his top priority, and when he grew old enough, Naruto would do everything within his power to make sure Naruto was robust enough to handle future battles. He took a sip of his tea, narrowed his eyes, and leaned back to look at the dark ceiling. If he moved each piece carefully, it would all fall into place. He had learned as a general of the ANBU that in such cases, subtlety and psychological warfare were more effective than fists and hands. His first objective was to make Konoha stronger than it had ever been. His second objective was to safeguard all of his beloved people, including Sakura, Itachi, Sasuke, Yondaime, Naruto, and everyone else. His final objective: take out Konoha's adversaries. A slow, almost sinister smirk spread across his good-looking features. They wouldn't be aware of the impact. Naruto, he glanced at the agitated-looking Yondaime, blearily entered the library, patted the whimpering Naruto on his back, and quickly wiped his face as the lights came on after hearing a low, drowsy voice. He yawned and clarified. Naruto woke up. The little tyke thought that it would be a good idea to wake his poor daddy up to keep him company as well. He swayed gently to soothe the child and lull him back to sleep. When Yondaime created the image, Naruto's lips quirked. If his adversaries could see him right now. With a petulant glare, Minato said, "I know what you were thinking." Naruto looked at him innocently. Naruto looked amused, and Yondaime glared at him, saying, "Don't give me that look." He frowned, adding, "If my enemies saw me now, they'd probably cancel the flee on sight order given to their subordinates with regard to me. You can laugh all you want. It will be your turn one day. I.M.So. Cool. I. Shit.Ice, mister. Let's see how macho you look trying to put your baby boy to sleep." Minato stopped as Naruto gave him a strange look and said, "Forget I said that." With a raised eyebrow, Naruto said, "It wasn't that dull." Minato sighed as the younger Namikaze's lips quirked. "Okay, maybe it was a little." Naruto arched his brow once more, and Minato scowled at him, saying, "All right, it was dull, but hold on, I'll be the cool, smooth Namikaze Minato again once I find my groove." Looking at him as if he were a fool, Naruto cocked his head to the side and said, "I'm not an idiot," Minato exclaimed. Glaring at him, and Naruto resisted the urge to scoff. "I'm not? Did no one teach you to respect your elders? How dare you?" Minato scowled at him after Naruto gave him a drab glance. "Geez, you make me feel so old." The former ANBU general raised an eyebrow once more. "I'm not old. I'm not even 30, I'll tell you that," I said, "you ma." When Naruto first spoke, he looked at the Yondaime with indifference and said, "Yondaime Sama, I do believe that you should go back to sleep." He got up and walked over to his father, taking the restless baby from him, saying, "The lack of sleep has addled your mind." Addled? As he was being gently led out of the library, Minato sputtered, "Who's the adult here?" he questioned angrily. With a cheesy smile, Naruto said, "Obviously not you." He then pushed his father hard into his room and said, "I'll put Naruto to bed. I don't have work tomorrow, but you do. So, go to bed." Minato nodded and huffed, then collapsed onto the bed with his eyes already closed. Naruto raised an eyebrow and then looked down at the baby in his arms, saying, "You're far less noisy than I expected you to be." All he received in response was a quivering little lip and watery eyes. "Yes, yes, little prince," he whispered as he closed the door to his father's room and left the mansion for the garden, keeping his senses open and alert. "Go to sleep now," he whispered into the child's ear. "You need to sleep to grow, to be strong and fit. See, you're sleepy, just being stubborn and giving everyone trouble." Naruto chuckled in amusement as he tapped Naruto's nose in a slight reprimand, acknowledging that Naruto's big yawn was so adorable that it made him laugh. The infant merely yawned, and Naruto grinned slightly as he continued to talk, telling tall, absurd stories, and little Naruto calmed down at the sound of his deep, calming baritone voice. Naruto soon fell asleep, and Naruto unwinded on the Ingawa without realizing that spies were observing everything he did. In a daze. That was his feeling. How many powerful drugs had been injected into his body was unknown to him. It felt heavy and weak, and he knew that his body wouldn't react the way it should if he tried to fight his way out. It was a white room with 4 glaringly bright walls and a single bed. He had no idea how long he had been held here. He had had trouble sleeping in the unbelievably bright room, and his eyes were hurting. He was worn out. He couldn't remember ever feeling so miserable and powerless in his life. He sat by himself, gazing into space, his thoughts muddled with anxiety, rage, and guilt. Occasionally, someone would enter the room and administer another medication to him, all in the name of healing, of course. After fighting pain and then Danzo's ANBU route, he was still injured. His prison, which Danzo referred to as a training facility, was a powerful instrument for brainwashing people, and Naruto would have given in if he hadn't been so obstinate. The temptation to just let the man win was almost too strong. Naruto-kun. He heard his trainer say in a soothing, calm voice, "I hate to see you like this." Naruto recognized the man as a master actor, but he spoke with concern. He whispered, "Naruto-kun, please look at me." Naruto's cold blue eyes found the man. He had a gentle, sage-looking trainer. His eyes were warm and brown, and there was a tinge of gray in his black hair. It was a nice face, but very dishonest. Naruto-kun, if you examine your own life closely you would understand why Danzo-sama states that Konoha has become weak under the influence of Sandaime-sama and Godem-sama. He gently added, "Just think, Naruto-kun. You, the Jinchuriki of the greatest of all tailed beasts, were simply abandoned." The man sighed. So much of power, gone to waste. You should have been trained, nurtured, given the means to channel that power and use it for Konoha, he continued. Weapon. Naruto clenched his fist and whispered. The man said softly, "No, not a weapon but a good shinobi." You love Konoha, Naruto-kun. It's your home, it contains your precious people, and it's a village your father gave his life for. You love it and wish to be able to protect it. He gave Naruto that sly, spine-tingling smile. With a carefully manicured expression of disbelief, he shook his head and said, "So much raw talent and everyone ignored it. Your own teacher, Hitaki Kakashi, ignored this skill in favor of the traitorous and mentally unbalanced Uchiha." He placed a file in front of Naruto and said, "It took you mere hours to master Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, just a few weeks to learn the Rasengan. You mastered the Sage Mode and went beyond your predecessors. Danzo-sama knows that you surpassed Jiraiya-sama." Naruto growled. His voice came out as a husky croak, "Don't talk about Sasuke." The man looked at someone in the room's corner and scowled. The girl approached him and offered him a glass of water. She was obviously beautiful and innocent looking. The idea that the water might have been tainted with drugs didn't interest him. He was too hydrated to consider that. Naruto-kun, he resumed, "Jiraiya-sama recognized your talent while everyone else ignored it. He nurtured the talent, but everyone knows that while he was a good teacher, his method of teaching wasn't appropriate for someone like you, someone so brilliant and creative. You needed to be pushed. You needed larger resources, better, sterner teachers." He leaned forward and focused on Naruto. "Remember your days in the academy, Naruto-kun. Remember your days in the orphanage where Sandaime-sama just left you in the care of those ignorant, hateful people. No one taught you what you needed to be taught. They were too afraid of your power, your potential. You deserved so much more." His trainer's words unavoidably brought back the unpleasant memories of his early years, and Naruto snorted while staring at the white walls with heavy lids. Sandaime-sama visited you, favored you, but was it enough? The most powerful man in Konoha, and he wasn't able to stop all that mental and emotional abuse? Why didn't he place you somewhere safe, a place where you would have been taught, taken care of and appreciated? Visiting you once or twice a month was enough. Don't you find his behavior a bit irresponsible? You and your father sacrificed so much for this village and he still didn't do anything to ensure your well-being except for passing a feeble law that was rather ineffective. Don't you see the injustice, the lack of thought in his actions?" With his eyes shut, Naruto said, "Yes." The man in front of him grinned. "You deserve so much more," he said quietly. "Danzo-sama has always stated that you were special and you needed to be treated that way. Konoha needs strong, loyal shinobi who are willing to protect the village at all costs." He appeared serious. "You must realize that there's a need for discipline and order," he said. "We keep losing powerful shinobi like Orochimaru, Uchiha Sasuke and so on. We lose them because they've forgotten loyalty. They've forgotten that their ambitions and their quest for power causes harm to our beloved village. You must understand that such behavior was partially encouraged by Sandaime-sama's soft-hearted ways. We have forgotten our roots, Naruto-kun. Our village is a military organization formed to protect the Fire Country. How can we do our duty if we allow our ninja to go scot-free like that?" The trainer said with a frown as Naruto looked at him. The trainer's eyes were sharp and determined. Our ninja need to be loyal. They need to be strong and well trained. He grumbled, they don't need to chase deranged cats across Konoha. They need to learn how to cope with the outside world. They need to start cultivating the skills that are needed to become a ninja, and the sooner they learn to do that, the better. When Naruto realized they hadn't given those extremely powerful drugs again, he suddenly became strong and said, "You're trying to turn me against Sandaime and Godaime's ideals." Kyuubi was gradually diminishing their power. The sharpness in Naruto's eyes did not deter the man from nodding. "Your loyalty to Konoha is admirable, Naruto-kun," he continued, "and Danzo. Sama loathes causing you so much trouble, but you need to understand that you're too powerful and influential for us to let you go." He turned to Naruto and said, "Your goals are similar to Danzo, Sama's goals. You wish for the well-being of Konoha, and so does Danzo, Sama. The only difference is the fact that Danzo, Sama has a more rigid manner when it comes to dealing with his subordinates." Naruto rubbed his temples in an effort to discourage the man went on, "I realize that Danzo, Sama isn't perfect." He grumbled, "but at least he errs on the side of caution. He only wishes to stop the weakness that he sees in our ranks, and you know that there's a weakness. You've suffered because of it with both the surviving Uchiha and Orochimaru." The individual in front of him was leaning forward. "You've been raised to be loyal to Sandaime and consequently Godem, and therefore you can't see their faults. However, you're an intelligent, observant man even though you don't show it. You must realize that you've been manipulated by circumstances. Danzo.Sam." Naruto interrupted angrily, a slight frown on his face as he ran his fingers through his hair. "You talk too much." He understood what the man was trying to say, in spite of himself. The fact that he was unaware of what Danzo had done to Tsunade and his other friends was the only thing he had against him. The man in front of Naruto nodded when he whispered, "Let me think about this." He put a file in front of Naruto and said, "Of course." He whispered, "Please consider the information carefully and without bias. There are facts in this file that would make things clearer for you." With an absent nod, Naruto began to work on the file. After observing him for some time, the man left the room, slamming the door behind him. Only then did Naruto start to loosen up. He continued to act as though he was looking through the file. His gaze swept over the words, but he failed to notice them. He was thinking about his circumstances inwardly. Konoha had been overrun by Danzo when it was weak. Many people would undoubtedly be pissed off by that, and the old bastard couldn't simply arrest everyone who disagreed with him. Tsunade was in custody, he thought. It was clear from logic that Danzo would not murder Tsunade. She wasn't exactly regarded as the best candidate for Hokage, even though she was a well-known healer and respected for her abilities. Despite her justifications, most people were unwilling to forgive her for abandoning Konoha once, and her propensity to gamble and drown herself in sake was legendary. She was not regarded by many as a capable Hokage. She didn't have the same level of respect as Yondaime and Sandaime. It would not take much, Naruto was sure, for Danzo to win over the daimyo and the civilians. He wouldn't want to cause doubt and anxiety when he was attempting to win over everyone if he killed Tsunade. But Danzo needed someone who was respected by the ninja community, particularly the younger generation of strong clan heirs. Naruto scowled, remembering how the Konoha people had roared in anger when Danzo had captured him. It was evident that he had at last earned Konoha's loyalty and respect. Danzo had his ANBU confront him, which infuriated the civilian faction as well as the ninja. They were all too aware of how many times Naruto had put his life in danger to save Konoha. Danzo desired to make use of him. Many would follow if Naruto was on his side. Naruto turned a page in the report and frowned thoughtfully. He took care to keep up the appearance that he was reading it. For him, this was an opportunity. Nearly everyone was aware that Tsunade was considering him as a potential successor to the position of Hokage when he reached adulthood. It would have likely been his turn to pursue Kakashi, but before Danzo took over, he was aware that he was very nearly realizing that dream. Naruto freely acknowledged that he lacked the subtlety and cunning necessary for what he had planned, but there was nothing else he could do. He knew that Tsunade was in danger, and since Sakura was Tsunade's apprentice, she was most likely also captured. Naruto didn't want to lose another teammate, but he had to leave and win Danzo's favor if he needed to assist anyone. Besides, he was prepared to assume the best about Danzo. Naruto would find a way to get rid of him if he made a mistake. Danzo had been greatly underestimated by Naruto. Naruaki. Without revealing his earlier thoughts, the young Namikaze lifted his gaze to his scowling father. "Why are you studying that seal so intently?" His eyes widened. "You aren't planning to use it again, are you?" With a graceful headshake, Naruaki said, I've made a mistake and I'm trying to find a way to correct it. Yondaime went somewhat pale. Making a mistake when applying the command of time seal would have serious repercussions. Mistake? He muttered. Naruaki nodded, the flush on his cheeks highlighting his fever. You understand the basic premise of command of time seal, don't you? He asked softly, pinning Minato with an inquisitive gaze. You must have encountered it a few times during your training in Fuin Jutsu. When the seal transports you to a different time, it alters you. Naruaki stood and motioned for Yondaime to look at his ankle after Yondaime nodded in agreement. As his father knelt down in front of him and looked at the seal, he whispered, the seal leaves behind a part of it on the body of the one being transported. Minato mumbled thoughtfully, I've never encountered this in my research. Naruaki scowled as he tried to find the right words to explain, that's because command of time seal is too powerful and dangerous to be used by just anyone. He added, a part of the knowledge about it is hidden. Consider the seal a sort of living entity. He nodded. Or rather consider it something that is programmed to analyze a person's intentions. If the intention is, if I'm to use a word, pure, then the true knowledge of how to perform the seal is given to the person. Minato questioned in shock, you mean to say that no one who intends to cause harm can use the seal? Naruaki nodded while scowling at the scroll on the desk. Minato muttered, ingenious. Naruaki scoffed in agreement. He whispered, ingenious is right. He pointed to the seal on his leg and said, I figured out why this is here. I've used it once and I still can't figure out how it works. He said, turning to face Minato, this is a very old seal, probably predates all the seals that we know now and we don't know who created it. Minato raised an eyebrow in inquiry and Naruaki scowled slightly. With a scholarly light shining in his eyes, he traced the seal design and said, this is basically a fail-safe. When I used the command of time seal, the price I paid was my identity. As he said, Minato became perplexed. I cannot be Uzumaki, Namikaze Naruto. I can't think of myself as Uzumaki Naruto nor can I take his place in this world. This little seal erases my identity, soon I'll start losing everything that I did as Naruto. My memories, my skills, my relationships, the name that I use for myself, my true name, I'll lose all of it. He chuckled, hell, I'll lose the color of my eyes and my hair as well. Everything that identifies me as Uzumaki, Namikaze Naruto will be gone. Duh, that's impossible, Yondaime said, his eyes wide and pale as he watched Naruaki. Naruaki muttered dryly, time travel is supposed to be impossible. He then shook his head. That's why I said that I did a mistake. He looked at himself. I ignored the fact that I felt weak and feverish, thinking that it was because Kyuubi was removed from me, but I was wrong. He sighed. Removing Kyuubi did affect me, but the consequences of that have mingled with the consequences of performing the seal and I can't distinguish between the two. He pulled out a piece of blank paper and began sketching a seal on it. Ignoring the panic that was brewing in his chest, Minato leaned forward to watch what Naruaki was doing. He completed sketching the auxiliary seal on paper and said, the command of time seal actually has an auxiliary seal to it. Despite being shoddy and hastily drawn, the design accomplished its goal. This seal is called Reforge. He clarified, essentially, I need the help of a blood relative to create a new identity in this world. The seal on my ankle will only break after I use the Reforge seal. He sighed, I knew that I had to establish a new identity, but I didn't know that I actually needed to use a seal for that. With his fingers running through his hair, Minato shook his head and said, I don't understand any of this. Naruaki sighed, let me explain this in the simplest of terms. He gestured towards the seal on his ankle. This seal is like a ticking time bomb. The moment I successfully traveled through time, this seal was formed on me. It will be on me until I know you perform the auxiliary seal to anchor me here and provide me with a new identity that is separate from Uzumaki, Namikaze Naruto. He looked into his father's eyes. Performing the Reforged seal on me would mean that you're basically adopting me. It depends on what you want me to be, your brother or your son. Naruaki snorted. Think of it this way, when a person changes his name, everything that he owns comes under that name. His bank accounts, his home, his children and family and friends, his very soul. He looked serious. Now, a person has an identity because there are others who acknowledge his identity. If a man changes his name and others refuse to accept it and still call him by his previous name, the change of name and identity becomes ineffective. Nodded. So you mean to say that the Reforged seal that I perform will convince that fail-safe seal that you've established a different identity here that's separate from Uzumaki, Namikaze Naruto, and I, as your blood relative, have accepted it. Once that's done, that seal will stop erasing your existence in this timeline and break. I'm basically adopting you and naming you Namikaze Naruaki by using the Reforged seal? I don't think I want to know who was brilliant in particular enough to come up with such a seal. Minato's eyes widened as Naruto nodded. This isn't just a technique, it is so much more than that. There are 3 elements to it. Naruto sighed and gave Minato a faint smirk before saying, we need to do this as soon as possible, but you need to understand one thing about performing a seal of such caliber. He gestured with his finger. The first is blood that represents your physical connection with me. I am your son and I have inherited many things from you. That's a very potent connection and therefore the seal must be drawn in your blood that is given without hesitation. Nodding, Naruto continued. Second is chakra. That's a spiritual connection that we share, and in this case we're lucky since both of us has similar chakra. Both of us possess wind chakra. That too must be given without hesitation on your part. He next looked his dad in the eye. The last is the effort and will that you put into the seal. You must truly believe that I'm as precious to you as you claim. He murmured, slightly ashamed of himself. You must choose what's more comfortable for you, me being your son or me being your brother. If you, even for a moment while performing the seal, show doubt, there would be consequences that I don't wish to think about. You must trust me with this. Minato said softly, looking at Naruto with serious blue eyes. I promise that I'll perform it properly. I won't let you fade away. After observing Minato for some time, Naruto nodded. He threw a scroll at him. I've written down a detailed description of the seal. There are diagrams explaining everything that you need to know. Go through that thoroughly. From start to end, you'll be the one to perform the seal. As Minato unfolded the scroll, Naruto got up and left the room. Sleep was what he wanted. Makoto grinned and held Naruto in her arms as she said, it's not a problem at all, Hokage. Sama. She hid her amusement as she politely ignored the young Hokage's endearing but sheepish expression. Thank you, Makoto-san. Minato nodded appreciatively and reached forward to tickle his little son's belly. I keep burdening you with this, he said softly, a sad light shining in his eyes. I admit that I'm a bit lost. Naruto's health isn't improving even though he tries to hide it, and I have work and I can't leave Naruto with him. He nervously ran his fingers through his hair. I realize that I'm not being much of a father, but there isn't much I can do right now. Makoto's eyes softened with sympathy, and she whispered calmingly, Minato-kun, because it upset her to see her beloved friend's husband appear so defenseless. Everything will work out fine, she assured. Right now you're dealing with a lot of things and it isn't easy for you. Neither Fugaku nor I mind having Naruto with us, she said without hesitation, smiling maternally as she looked down at the baby in her arms. And Sasuke and Itachi have started to grow a bit attached to him. She laughed lightly, grateful to see the relieved smile on his face. I'm afraid soon you'll never get to keep Naruto to yourself. Minato laughed and said, that's a relief. He bowed to her and said, I'm very grateful. He looked at his wristwatch and said, I must leave. He muttered, thank you for your assistance, Makoto-san. A ninja approached Minato as he began to make his way back to his house and began to stroll casually beside him. Minato merely gave him a quick glance as the man whispered, I received several reports from my ANBU. They've informed me in detail about our new recruit and his strength. Is that so? Minato asked, waving at the kids who cheered when they saw him. He didn't stop in his tracks, but he smiled at their excited cries. And what are your thoughts? His lips quirked as he whispered, cunning. He's leading us on, Minato. He's a true ANBU, and like any true ANBU, he'll use only what's needed to perform the missions. Skilled, but we don't know how powerful he is and how he would deal with fighting powerful opponents face.to. Face. The man glanced at his superior and said, I suggest we have him fight someone strong head. On to see just how capable he is. With a slight nod of acknowledgement, Minato said, very well. You must be proud, Minato. The other man paused, his amused green eyes gleaming, and said, you've given me a fine air. Minato looked up at the sky and laughed. Oh, let's not jump the gun, shall we, General? He murmured, I'm impressed with the skills he has displayed so far, but he is too young, despite what he thinks, to take on so much responsibility. Yes, knowing what is going to happen would weigh on his mind, making him feel responsible for things that he has no control over, the other man said, nodding with calculating eyes. Minato agreed with him. For now, I'll give him complete freedom to do as he wishes with that knowledge. He would know the consequences of his own actions better than I. With a silver brow, the ANBU asked, you trust him that much? Minato sighed, my boy has this innate sense of justice, Sasuke. He said, and the tendency to feel as though he needs to protect everyone and save everyone, even at the cost of his own well-being. He turned to look at him. That, my friend, is why I trust him. The other man said, with loyalty that only comes from years of strong friendship, and I trust your judgment. That made Minato smile. Even if you do, I'll be placing my son in your care, Sasuke. You need to see if he is worth your time. He glanced at the man with silver hair. I'll inform you as soon as I can arrange something. He reassured him, I need to deal with a few things first. Sasuke whispered elegantly, of course. Then he cast a sidelong glance at something. You were always popular, Minato. He laughed, especially amongst those shy, secretive girls. The imposing general laughed. Now it seems, they will have another mystery to solve. I've seen a few sneaking glances at Naruaki. With skillful ease, Minato repressed his natural response, grinning amusedly at his friend. He understood the underlying message of his ANBU general's statement. He is rather interesting. With a furious frown on his face, Minato raised a brow and said, they're gone. Green eyes narrowed dangerously, concealed by a curtain to silky silver hair. He gave a hazy gesture while glancing at the dark corner. Minato saw an ANBU hurrying out of his hiding spot and heading after the unidentified spy. Someone is getting too bold. Take care of your family, Minato. Sasuke issued a warning. Iwa obviously knows of Naruaki now. Just a few nights ago, one of my men caught an Iwa missing. Nin by your manner. They would love nothing more than getting their hands on one of your sons. With a worried frown, Minato said, I think it is high time we start to reevaluate our security. He muttered, I didn't think it was possible for anyone to simply slip into Konoha without us noticing. Sasuke gave a nod of approval. Usually, it isn't. He murmured, however, there are a faction of people within our ranks that aren't under your control, Minato. Because of this there's a weakness in our security. With his cold blue eyes narrowed, he whispered, nay. With an unusual tone of hesitancy in his voice, Sasuke nodded and muttered, that and some others. This time, Danzo may not be the one to blame. An internal conflict not attributed to him? Minato raised an eyebrow. With a slight frown, Sasuke favored Minato and shrugged, asking, give me some time. I'm still trying to unearth this whole thing. Did Naruaki say anything with regard to this? He asked. Minato grinned adoringly. Green eyes looked at him with amusement. Ah, he laughed. He likes to be cryptic. He's being cautious about the information he gives me. He simply gives me hints and lets me act on my own accord. In front of Yondaimi's manor, they came to a stop. Before mockingly bowing to Minato, Sasuke said, I think that's a good thing. Good day, Hokage. Sama. As he passed the gates, Minato waved and laughed at him, a wave of chakra caressing him, assessing him before granting him entry. Regretfully, the security measure was ineffective in stopping outsiders from spying into the manor. When he entered his house, Naruaki was already awake. He appeared to be very at ease as he read a book. Minato watched him for some time, making sure no one knew he was there. Over the past month, he had been merely watching Naruaki a lot. When he was not aware of Yondaimi's presence, he spied on his son out of an unquenchable desire to know and comprehend him. Just silently watching him taught him a lot. He would identify some of the gestures that were strikingly similar to Kushina with mixed emotions. He had seen Naruaki imitate this habit several times, the propensity to tap her temple when she was focused on something. He also inherited from Kushina that reckless elegance in the fluid, dancer-like motions. A person developed such grace, and Minato was certain that his son had been extremely awkward and uncoordinated in his early years. The frown he had frequently observed on Naruaki's lips was exactly like his own. Although the eye's shape was entirely Kushina's, he was responsible for their color and the way they glowed with wisdom. Little things. Little actions were gradually persuading the doubtful part of him that Naruaki was, in fact, his son. He experienced episodes of incredulity from time to time. How could there be someone who was both so different and so like him? How could his son be this jaded, talented, completely unintelligible young man? How many days have passed since Naruaki entered his life and saved his life as well as the lives of innumerable Konoha ninja? It felt like a year had passed even though it had only been a month. He saw Naruaki flip through a page in his book, thinking about him in silence, then moving forward to make himself known. His eyes instantly met Naruaki's and he raised a brow in silent inquiry. Minato whispered, we should perform the seal. His son nodded, tucked a bookmark into the book, and put it away. As they made their way to a spare room that had been set aside for their use, Naruaki questioned, are you sure you have memorized everything? In response, Minato nodded and held up a bottle of specific pills. He recalled the big, intricate design of the seal they were going to use and said, I got this from a healer, just in case I lose too much blood. Naruaki shrugged off the awkwardness of being in front of his father in just his boxers and nodded in agreement before taking off his yukata as he entered the room. Minato began the delicate task of drawing the runes without even looking at him. Before beginning to draw the runes on the floor, he cut the palm of his right hand and allowed the blood to surface. A huge, spider-web like pattern began to slowly come apart on the floor. Both Minato and Naruaki's blue eyes were fixed on the design, and their noses were irritated by the blood smell. Ignoring the sting in his hand, Minato scowled as he turned to face Naruaki. "Well, what do you think?" Inwardly, the younger Namikaze marveled at the rune's near perfectionism as he carefully examined the design. Certainly his father was no slouch. He had only needed a few hours to comprehend the seal in its entirety. As he took his place, Naruaki reassured everyone, "It's perfect." The Yondaime drew the remaining portion of the seal on Naruaki's body while kneeling in front of him after giving him a nod. Drawing a circular seal on the top of each foot, he then stood on each knee and drew the same seal on Naruaki's forehead and chest. After raising his hands to allow Yondaime to draw the seal on the inside of his wrists, Naruaki turned around and drew the seals on the back of his neck and his lower back. Minato nodded as Naruaki whispered, "I think that's it." He then cautiously stepped out of the web and stood on its very edge. "Let's just hope that there are no adverse effects of this." Naruaki, Minato squinted and said, "You take too many risks for my liking." He shrugged and said, "Comes with the job." The Hokage snorted and took one last look at the seal, looking for flaws. When he couldn't find any, he paused to gaze into Naruaki's eyes before beginning to channel chakra into the seal. The seal didn't even respond to his prodding in one horrifying instance. Panicked, he looked at Naruaki, but the boy merely arched an eyebrow at him. He clenched his jaw and looked down at the seal. You can trust the brat to be so unconcerned about the circumstance. He had no intention of failing. Because he couldn't perform a single seal, he wouldn't lose his son. Minato was brought to his knees by the seal's abrupt reaction. He had the impression that he was being thoroughly searched. He sensed that his soul was being assessed. It was then that he realized why Naruaki had insisted that the seal was unique. He dismissed the idea and steadily guided his chakra through the seal, observing the runes as they moved, glowed, and then crawled over Naruaki's body. Narrowing his eyes to pick up on even the slightest shifts, he tracked the runes' movements. Minato had already placed the little seals on his son, and now Naruaki was painted with the runes that had been on the floor. It was intriguing. He saw Naruaki's eyes glaze over and his chakra flare brightly as it spilled out of control. As the runes moved and adjusted, the seal hissed ever so slightly and glowed bright red. The glowing abruptly stopped, and Naruaki began to drop forward with his eyes closed. With a muttered curse, Minato hurried forward to grab his son before he could fall to the ground. With Naruaki's head resting on his lap, he took a seat and examined the slowly vanishing seals. They appeared to be settling into Naruaki's body. Naruaki's breath caught for a second before he calmed down, and Minato narrowed his eyes. That was it. He saw the seal that had been on Naruaki's ankle break and melt away, leaving no sign of it. As he checked the younger Namikaze, he exhaled a sigh of relief. All of a sudden, he was healthy. Minato grunted and raised Naruaki after shaking his head in amazement. Although the boy had the thin physique of a teenager, Minato found it challenging to carry him appropriately due to his height, which was nothing to laugh at. His lips twitched in relief, but he moaned about tall, lanky, troublesome brats as he stalked towards Naruaki's room. His new job had nothing to do with being a Hokage. It was 100 times harder to be a father. Particularly if one of your kids was a teenager who did not give a damn about his own life. As Minato emerged ahead of him and Naruaki followed shortly after, idly looking around, Sasuke remarked, "I didn't expect it to be so soon." Within a day, the younger Namikaze had recovered, and Minato was keen to find a quick solution to Naruaki's ANBU placement issue. With those watchful eyes on his friend, the young Hokage cast a quick glance at Naruaki. Minato scowled as the youngest of the three showed no signs of recognizing the silver-haired ANBU. Either Naruaki didn't know Sasuke at all, or he was a very talented actor. Minato was troubled by that knowledge. Even though he had designated Jiraiya as Naruto's godfather, he was aware that Sasuke would be responsible for his child in the event of his death. If Naruaki was unaware of Sasuke, it implied that his friend had either passed away or disappeared. Minato was more troubled by it than he would ever acknowledge. He had made the decision to not question Naruaki on Sandame's advice, but the temptation to do so was strong. His son might not have taken into account a lot of things that Minato knew were crucial. But his forerunner had been right. Only Naruaki would be aware of the repercussions of his own behavior, and Yondaime was gradually beginning to respect his son's judgment. Minato called out to the younger Namikaze, "Naruaki." He said, "This is Nakagawa Sasuke. Currently, he is the general of the ANBU." Naruaki gave Sasuke a startled look before bowing in greeting. The general looked at Naruaki with evaluative green eyes and nodded, saying, "Sasuke, This is Namikaze Naruaki, as you well know. As Sasuke leaned back against a tree and watched Naruaki intently, Minato remarked, Naruaki, you must be aware that the missions I assigned you were simply to test your abilities. With a nod, the younger Namikaze appeared somewhat perplexed. I've decided that you're skilled enough to be an ANBU. However, while your performance in those missions told me a great deal about your skills in Fuin Jutsu and your ability in espionage and assassination, I'm still unsure about your other skills. Yondaime looked at Naruaki's grimace. Under normal circumstances, we know almost everything about an ANBU candidate from his instructors, family, mentors and team mates. Therefore, their performance during test missions is enough to get them into the ANBU, and we have enough information to place them in appropriate squads. He turned to look at Sasuke, who gave him a nod before turning back to his son. You, on the other hand, are an unknown entity. I can't possibly contact those who know you best to understand your skills and your level of competence. I don't know where to place you or how you'd be of use to me in emergency situations. He grinned at Naruaki's acknowledgement. As your skills are unknown to me, I can't bring myself to trust you when it comes to very important missions. Neither I nor Sasuke can place you in an appropriate squad without knowing just what level you're at. Naruaki's eyes narrowed as he looked from Yondaime to the general. A spar? Sasuke leaned forward and looked at Naruaki intently, saying, Yes, Naruaki-kun. He looked at the youngest of them seriously and said, We've decided that for us to trust your strength, we need to see it for ourselves. Naruaki raised an eyebrow at that, saying, Your father is concerned, rightly so, about the task you have given yourself. The general whispered in a low voice, Both of us wish to help you in any way we can, but we must adhere to certain rules and norms that could possibly hinder your mission. I'm told that you succeeded me as the ANBU general, isn't that right? Nodding, Naruaki said, Yes. Sasuke narrowed his eyes in mild distaste and said, Well, as the general, you come under the direct command of the Hokage, but until you reach that stage, the council has access to you, and that includes Danzo. Since your arrival is so suspicious and the fact that you're related to Minato is well known, you'll be watched closely, and that concerns us. You won't have much freedom to use your knowledge to the fullest. Naruaki said, I realize that. He was a little taken aback that his father had confided in someone enough to tell him the truth about Naruaki's predicament. He was aware of Namikaze Minato's difficulty with trust. Good. Sasuke nodded firmly. Giving you too much power and authority right now is very risky, and it'll compromise Minato's credibility. Therefore, we'll be doing everything we can to bring you into an influential position without giving anyone a reason to suspect us of ulterior motives. He gestured towards Yondaime with a frown. As of now, your father is considered to be the most powerful shinobi in Konoha. He's well respected and has the admiration of the civilian and ninja population. Our goal is for you to develop a similar reputation. Once you have integrated yourself into the higher echelons of our power structure, you can carry out your plans with the freedom that you don't have now. He looked at Naruaki with approval. You've already started taking steps in the right direction. From what I've gathered, most consider you a subdued and a more silent version of your father. Moreover, taking Uchiha Itachi as an apprentice was a good move, even if you had other reasons for it. This puts you in the good books with the Uchiha clan. Naruaki nodded and shook his head slightly, saying, I understand what you're trying to say, sir. I didn't expect to have the same influence that I had before. What I have in mind would take years for subtle planning and actions. Which, he said dryly, would possibly put me in the bad books with the Hyuga clan. With a slight smirk, Sasuke cocked his head to the side. He looked at Minato and then back at Naruaki, saying, You're very interesting. He pointed to Yondaime and said, You definitely didn't inherit your intelligence from this baka. Oh. Naruaki laughed. Believe me, sir, this isn't something I inherited but rather developed. Minato scowled at them, saying, Don't go ganging up on me. You're supposed to defend me and be on my side, he said, frowning at Naruaki. I'm your father. He turned to the general, narrowing his eyes, and adding, And I'm your best friend. Naruaki grinned as Sasuke said dryly, That doesn't make you any less stupid. Minato became agitated and asked, Are we going to spar or not? When Naruaki saw that Sasuke was also carrying a sword, his hand instantly went to the hilt of the weapon on his back. He squinted, but before the younger one could draw any conclusions, Minato intervened. You'll be fighting me. Sasuke is here just to observe. Naruaki froze and raised an eyebrow at his father. His eyes were sharp as he studied Minato for a moment, and then a slow smirk appeared on his lips. This will be interesting. In response, Minato squinted his eyes, his expression now solemn and focused. As he positioned himself with his hand still on the hilt of his sword, Naruaki whispered, Whatever you can do, I can as well. Rasengan. He waved his hand dismissively. I have known it since I was 13. Frog summon is the same, though I'm certain I can't summon them anymore, but as I was tied to them previously and they haven't declared me an enemy, they can't harm me. And Hiraishin, his smirk widened, as a piece of cake. When Naruaki confessed, Minato looked at Sasuke and was not shocked to see the general standing erect. His lips curled into a smirk at the challenge, but his eyes remained bright as he turned back to face his son. He forced aside the sense of pride that was about to overtake him and said, "That's not all I know, boy, those are just a few things that I'm famous for." At 13, Rasengan. His son was a little prodigy, which was amazing. The sharp sound of Naruaki's sword being drawn rang in their ears as he grinned and said, "Well, Drawling, you don't know much about me, either." Before their shapes became hazy as they moved at remarkable speeds, both father and son smiled. Minato had arrived ready to spar with his son, who was brandishing a sword. He had previously served as an ANBU, and all ANBU received basic kenjutsu training. As straightforward as it could be between two extremely talented opponents, it began that way. Neither moved an inch. Many would have been overwhelmed by Naruaki's strength and endurance combined with his almost blinding speed, but Minato responded naturally and instinctively. It would take a lot more for Naruaki to start perspiring. Before straightening up, the younger blonde froze for a second, gazing at Minato with bright blue eyes. He muttered, "I guess you're serious," before his face lost all emotion and vitality. His eyes narrowed and calculating, he slipped into a stance slowly and elegantly. Before taking a tiny step forward, he adjusted his sword grip. Then he was gone. Minato reacted in time to seize Naruaki's sword with his own, thinking, "Wonderful." As Naruaki kept him on the defensive, he analyzed, "This is obviously beyond even young Hayate's caliber." When Naruaki fell to the ground, Minato smirked and somersaulted, his sword a white blur as it moved to inflict damage on Yondaimi's legs. Impressed by the quick response, Naruaki arched a brow. He was now the one who had to defend after the last stunt, which was a gamble, failed. His dad wasn't a slacker. The training ground was filled with the deafening sounds of steel on steel. It was obviously a standstill. Despite using the sword, Naruaki was not a master of kenjutsu. It was obvious to Sasuke that he needed more polish. Although his method worked well against novices and individuals with only rudimentary sword skills, such as Yondaimi, masters of kenjutsu would still defeat him. It would require their focus and effort. Minato whispered, "Let's test this, shall we?" as he took a scroll out of his kunai pouch. After spotting the kanji, Naruaki's eyes narrowed. He then hissed, bit his thumb, and tapped his bloodied fingers against a few invisible seals on his body. His body felt lighter and more nimble instantly. Just in time, as the whole clearing was now covered in kunai that looked familiar. Naruaki's mouth quirked. He could also use Hiraishin, but that would negate the fight's goal. If they continued dancing around, his father would not be able to see how talented he was. It was fascinating to watch his father's signature technique. Seeing it and doing it were two different things. It was amazing to watch his father accomplish this, which was his greatest accomplishment. No warning was given. There was nothing to monitor his father's movements. Those incapable of performing the intricate time space jutsu found it almost incomprehensible. His father's movements were unpredictable, moving from one location to another in an instant, leaving almost no trace behind. Naturally, Naruaki's reaction was instinctive. His body was far too used to sparring at such high speeds. He was well aware, though, that Hiraishin's speed grew with time. It's true, Naruaki's natural, hard. 1 speed was soon being overtaken by his father's technique. The younger Namikaze was having fun in spite of the impending defeat that he could already see coming. A dark, mocking light came into his eyes as he grinned. The fingers of his free hand began to twitch as he struggled to keep up with the incessant, imperceptible flashes of steel and movement. Naruaki was not limited to using only kenjutsu and fuinjutsu. Kaiten. Tsunami no jutsu. Minato took an oath, hurled a tri-pronged kunai into the air, and sprang swiftly from the ground as there was a great roar of flames. Like a huge destructive wave, fire swept across the clearing, putting out everything in its path. The Hokage defended himself somewhat unsteadily, and Naruaki's smirk widened sinisterly as he disappeared from his position, his sword once more meeting Yondaimi's. Blue eyes met blue. He whispered, "Kage Bunshin no Jutsu." This time, he did not use seals, and many clones materialized. All of them focused on Yondaimi as the real Naruaki landed on the scorched ground and gazed with a certain pleasure at the burnt Hiraishin kunai. They were now free of seals. The renowned method of his father had just been momentarily thwarted. He knew full well that a mere touch would apply a tracking seal to him from the Yondaimi. The general gave a small laugh, but Naruaki chose to ignore it in order to focus on his father. Yondaime was staring down at him with calculating blue eyes after disposing of all of his clones with absurd ease. This was a veteran of the war. Naruaki changed his position. He told himself, well, so am I. He realized that they were elevating the conflict when he saw his father sheath his sword and hurl it at the general. Rather than handing the general his treasure, Naruaki sealed his sword inside a scroll, putting it away with far more respect than his father had. The weight seals on his body had finally disappeared, and he bounced a little on his heels. With the weight seals off, his body was inherently more nimble and quick. He had crafted his seals so that the weight would gradually be released. He was able to maintain control over his body because of that. It kept him from being stiff or overcompensating. That was fortunate because his father launched an attack right away. There was no doubt that his father's taijutsu was better than his own. Elegant and accurate in ways that Naruaki's was never. Naruaki's experience and sheer unpredictable nature compensated for his lack of refinement. The deft use of clones by Naruaki shocked Minato. They were all focused on attacking and overpowering him because there were so many of them. In addition to learning more about Naruaki's abilities, he was also discovering a lot about himself during the spar. He became aware that he had become somewhat overly dependent on his highly valued Hiraishin jutsu. Fighting Naruaki's clones was similar to fighting several opponents, and it appeared that he had become dependent on Hiraishin exclusively for this type of fighting. As he focused on neutralizing the clones and keeping an eye out for the real Naruaki, Minato thought, such mastery over such a mundane jutsu. He noted, I can't imagine how much he must have worked with them to develop such a complex style of combat. The clones fight as though they're individuals, each with their own tactics and jutsu. Minato proudly watched his son execute the technique flawlessly, avoiding the word, Rasengan, as soon as he heard it. Seeing the young man follow his lead was such a great pleasure. The idea that Naruaki had inherited everything from him would have delighted him. He was unable to ignore Kushina's contribution despite his good looks, smiles, and abilities. Minato saw more and more Kushina in his son the more time he spent with him. Minato had a flashback to Kushina's style because of the unpredictable nature of his attacks, the untamed and overwhelming techniques he employed, and the thought and creativity that went into each move. The thing that worried Minato the most was ninjutsu. After Kyuubi was taken away, Naruaki had admitted that he was unsure if he had maintained his ninjutsu proficiency. He had no idea how long he could stay in a ninjutsu battle or how much chakra he could use. He inhaled deeply and collected his chakra. Kaden, Karyu Enden. With his fingers already forming seals, Naruaki persisted, saying, Futon. Kazikiri no Jutsu. Wind Cutter. Despite the wind element's inherent weakness against fire, a sizable wind blade developed that readily cut through the fire technique. As the smaller, less lethal form of Rasenshuriken formed on the palm of his hand, Naruaki swiftly followed its trajectory and whispered, Futon. Rasengan. After mastering Rasenshuriken, he realized that he could use it as an offensive jutsu that used less chakra. This is how he perfected this technique. Minato barely avoided it, his arm and shoulder being cut by tiny wind blades. Examining his bleeding arm, he skidded to a stop a short distance from Naruaki. Since Naruaki's goal had only been to incapacitate, he had deliberately avoided using the lethal technique on his father. The Hokage gave his son a narrowed look. Even though it had only been a quick blow, it had caused enough damage to rip through his clothing and leave deep scratches. That attack would have been fatal if it had been made head-on. His son's improvement over the Rasengan was too much for him to comprehend. He began fighting seriously because he wanted to test Naruaki's strength and push him to the limit. His efforts paid off. Naruaki was amazing. A number of Kage Bunshin would emerge in the clearing, diverting his attention, and his fingers seemed to merely twitch. He mostly employed Futon Jutsu, which is incredibly powerful and accurate. Minato was impressed by Naruaki's level of elemental chakra mastery. It was truly remarkable that an 18-year-old boy could master Futon Jutsu to such an extent. Raiden. Raryu no Tatsumaki. Minato saw Naruaki frown as his dragon roared in his direction. He was astounded by what followed. Futon. Rasenshuriken. He caught Sasuke straightening up out of the corner of his eye. As if it were nothing, he watched with wide eyes as shuriken. Like jutsu totally destroyed the dragon and the clone carrying it. Without even losing a shred of its power, the formidable technique grew in midair, slicing through the dragon and continuing on, destroying a number of trees and rocks before it vanished. Glancing at Naruaki, he was astounded to see that icy blue was staring back at him. His son appeared to be tired and perspiring, but not enough to quit the battle. With narrowed eyes, Naruaki hurled himself at Minato. When the Hokage saw that even Naruaki's glances appeared to cause some damage, he reacted instantly and refrained from wincing. They traveled quickly, faster than even the majority of Junin could manage. At last, it came down to the most basic of all ninja techniques. A spar that is founded on unadulterated, instinctive taijutsu. The mindless rhythm of slapping blows engrossed them both. Without any conscious thought, their hands moved, and his bodies changed positions based only on muscle memory that had been cultivated over years of practice. Naruaki could see his body gradually aching from stress. He was conscious of the tiny drop of blood streaming down the side of his face from the cut on his temple, and he could feel the perspiration running down his heated back. It was impossible to avoid feeling his father's influence and pressure. That man refused to move no matter what he did. He gave as well as he received. He knew that his loss was imminent because he could feel himself gradually slipping. However, Naruaki could tell that Minato wasn't disappointed in him by the proud sparkle in his father's eyes. When Minato's fist fell heavily on his stomach, causing him to slam against the ground in agony, he gasped in surprise. As his father landed on top of him and pinned him with a kunai against his neck, he coughed and winced. He was defeated. Naruaki inhaled deeply, trembling, and gazed up at the Hokage, seeing the hard blue eyes soften. "Very well done," Minato muttered, putting his kunai aside and reaching forward to run his fingers lovingly through Naruaki's hair. With a laugh, Naruaki threw back his head and looked up at the sky, his eyes sparkling with joy. "That was brilliant." In a rare moment of openness, he said in a hoarse whisper, "Man, Dad, you're awesome." Minato stopped and grinned astonishedly at his weary son. Unbeknownst to Naruaki, this was the first time he had spoken to Yondaime so casually in almost a month. Only when Naruaki referred to him as "Father" did this come close. As he helped his son stand up, the Hokage's grin widened as he looked at the boy's injuries with concern. He looked up at his best friend and said, "So, Sasuke, what do you think of Naruaki?" The general smirked and said, "After that performance, I don't think I'm going to let anyone else get their hands on him." His green eyes were fixed on the younger Namikaze for a considerable amount of time. With a smile of admiration, he turned to face Naruaki and said, "Your chakra capacity is well above cage level as it is. It doesn't seem as though Kyuubi's extraction has affected that too much. My ninjutsu library requires a lot of chakra. It's good to know that my large chakra capacity isn't due to Kyuubi," Naruaki said, shrugging with a small, pleased smile. The commander nodded to Naruaki. "Welcome to the ANBU forces, Naruaki-kun. You'll be placed in Unit 4, whose captain is scheduled to retire in 3 months. You'll be under his guidance for the duration of those 3 months before you take over his position." He returned Minato's sword to him. "From this moment on, you will also be my apprentice. I've analyzed your strengths and weaknesses and believe that I can take your skills a step further, especially when it comes to kenjutsu." Naruaki sighed and stretched his aching muscles as he nodded. He placed a cautious hand on his bruised stomach and thought, "I'm going to feel this keenly tomorrow." With a faint, amused smirk, Sasuke knelt before him and began dressing his wounds. Naruaki observed the general's glowing hands hovering over his wounds, which were gradually healing on their own. "Taking you to the hospital would be unwise. The healers will have your father's head this. In their opinion, you should have rested longer." They moved at an unusual pace, though not nearly as quickly as they did when he had the Kyuubi. The general said absently, "I see you've inherited the Uzumaki clan's natural resilience." Minato grinned in response. An additional indication that Naruaki was their son. Glancing down at the wounds that were healing slowly, Naruaki raised an eyebrow. An additional benefit that appeared to come naturally. Kyuubi, he was sure, only made it better. Even so, he had serious doubts about his ability to recover from severe injuries like the one Sasuke had given him during the battle in the Valley of the End. Although Kyuubi's presence had been more of a curse than a benefit, he still felt that such sacrifices were ultimately worthwhile even though he didn't feel as invulnerable as he had previously. Kyuubi would turn out to be nothing more than a boon to Naruto. He would never have to deal with the hurt of being a Jinchuriki or the prejudice of the villagers. The day Kyuubi was ingrained in him was something he would never regret. However, Naruaki had deep wounds that were unlikely to heal. The Kyuubi had caused him too much suffering, and he had no regrets about its absence. When Sasuke moved to heal Minato, he was taken out of his reverie. "It has been a while since anyone has been able to reduce you to such a state, Minato." With a raised eyebrow, the Hokage asked, "Anyone but you mean?" "Come now, Hokage. Sama," said the green eyes, looking up at him with amusement. "You give me too much credit." "HN." Minato sneered, then turned to face Naruaki. "You okay?" she asked. Naruaki's eyes remained uninterested as he raised an eyebrow at him. He nodded briefly to his father before running his fingers through his long hair and arranging it. He tied his hair with a skillful flick of his wrist and turned to leave. "If that is all, I have a book waiting to be read. Minato rolled his eyes and muttered a complaint as he and Sasuke followed Naruaki out of the training grounds. Minato glared at him before he could say anything, saying, "If you're about to sprout some lame joke about me not being able to read or being stupid, save it." Sasuke laughed as Naruaki smirked at him over his shoulder. "I don't get what's so fascinating about that book. Why is it that you and my son are so alike?" He scowled, eyes narrowing suspiciously at Sasuke. "You weren't getting frisky with my wife behind my back, were you?" he asked. Sasuke staggered in disbelief, staring at Minato with wide eyes as Naruaki choked. The general asked incredulously, "What did you say?" as Naruaki gave him a startled look. Minato just gave himself a smug smile, congratulating himself on surprising both his friend and his son. He apologized silently to Kushina. After observing his father for some time, Naruaki shook his head incredulously. "Is it always like that between the two of you?" he asked, raising a brow in response to the general's amused green eyes. "Well, we have been friends all our lives. That didn't change when we got into separate genin teams or when he became the Hokage. I teased him relentlessly then, I do so now," Sasuke said, cocking his head with a slight smirk. Minato laughed. "As we grew older, I learned to give back just as good as I got, so whenever the both of us meet, we make it a point to annoy the hell out of each other." After giving them a funny look, Naruaki let his gaze wander around the Junin lounge they had just entered. When he saw Jiraiya's recognizable white hair, he stopped and froze in disbelief. Horrified, he muttered to himself, "What the hell?" Sasuke and Minato stopped and gave him a curious look. With his fingers twitching toward the hilt of his sword, he asked, "Is that who I think he is?" pointing to the man standing next to Jiraiya, his face pale with shock. "Orochimaru. Sama?" Sasuke asked, looking at the man and raising an eyebrow. "He's one of the Sannin, your godfather's best friend. Surely you know of him?" he asked, looking at Naruaki bewildered. Naruaki's lips thinned in annoyance, and his eyes narrowed. Orochimaru's presence in Konoha was not something he had anticipated. Orochimaru appeared to be a little worm in comparison to those like Pain and Madara, but he was well aware of the threat the snake Sannin pose. To be honest, when Kyuubi asked him to go back in time, he had never even thought of Orochimaru. It was shocking to see him so unexpectedly. Sensing that something was amiss, Minato quietly led Naruaki from the lounge. Sasuke gave Orochimaru a suspicious look and then followed them. As he tried to remember as much as he could about Orochimaru's past in Konoha, Naruaki bit his lip and ran his fingers through his hair. He was pathetically ignorant of the traitor. He had been too young for Sandaime or Jiraiya to tell him anything about Orochimaru, and Sasuke had made him stop worrying about the bastard as he grew older. He had to tread carefully. Running his sword through that slimy pedophile had been his first instinct, but he might be doing more harm than good. This was something he had to consider. "Naruaki," Minato muttered, "is there something wrong? Should we know something about Orochimaru-san?" The younger Namikaze gave his father a thoughtful look. He appeared to have made up his mind at last. "You're not going to like this." Minato scowled. Before Minato could respond, Sasuke stated, "Obviously, you hadn't expected Orochimaru. Sama's presence here and your reaction was negative. It doesn't matter, Naruaki-kun, whether he likes it or not." After looking at the general, Minato nodded and said, "Sasuke is right, Naruaki. This seems like a sensitive matter. We should take this to my office," he said. As they made their way to Yondaime's office, the younger Namikaze nodded and said nothing. He was trying to remember as much as he could about Orochimaru's sins, but his mind was confused. He didn't know if his father would believe him. After they were comfortable in the office, Minato turned to face him and asked him in a quiet voice to clarify. Naruaki closed his eyes thoughtfully and sighed. When the implication of his statement registered, Minato froze, narrowing his eyes at Naruaki. "You're correct in assuming that I hadn't expected Orochimaru to be here. By here, I mean Konoha. With this one, I'll need your help." He grinned at Minato. "I don't know much about the man's past, nor do I know if he is redeemable or if he has already conducted those vile human experiments that he so loves to do." With his eyebrows raised in surprise, Yondaime questioned, "Human experiments? You don't mean?" Naruaki muttered curses as he attempted to piece together bits of information. "Look, Orochimaru was a great problem when I just became a genin. He caused a lot of pain." He grimaced when he recalled Sasuke's treachery and Sandaime's death. "From age 12 to 15, he was our primary goal, but when I come to think of it, I never bothered as much with him as our other enemies. I was so focused on getting my best friend out of his clutches that most of the time, I didn't bother to look into that man's past." He sighed. "Frankly speaking, compared to the others that I have faced, Orochimaru was child's play. He was sick and vile, but..." Minato questioned incredulously, Naruaki, what are you saying? Are you implying that Orochimaru became a missing nin? He solemnly nodded, yes. I don't know what exactly happened and when it happened. All I know that Sandaime Sama caught him conducting some experiments on human subjects, sometimes children, and he wasn't exactly pleased with the fact that you became the Yondaime instead of him. Rubbing the bridge of his nose, Naruaki leaned forward and said, geez, I can't believe that just slipped my mind. Sasuke leaned forward and said, Naruaki-kun, how much can you tell us about Orochimaru and his defection? It was evident to him that Naruaki was annoyed with himself. The general wanted to reassure him that no one expected him to save everyone and make amends because he was upset that he could forget something so important. Obviously, Naruaki couldn't just snap his fingers and make everything right, and the knowledge of the future was a burden. I can't tell you much about how and when Orochimaru defected, but I can tell you what he did after the defection. The rest, I leave it up to you. Just consult me before you take any action. He was running his fingers through his hair in apparent anger. Man, that bastard has a hand in everything. I need to think. I need to understand just how much his actions affected everything else, weigh the pros and cons, damn it. Minato went to kneel in front of Naruaki and whispered, hey now. Calm down. Okay? Tell us everything and we'll decide what to do together. Obviously, you feel that disposing of him now isn't a wise decision. You must have some reason for that. Don't worry much, we'll resolve the issue. After observing him for a while, Naruaki nodded in agreement and appeared to relax. Glad that Minato had managed to appease Naruaki before attracting their attention, Sasuke leaned back and said, start from the very beginning, Naruaki-kun. Don't skip even the smallest detail.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.